The smell struck him before the sight could register. It was not the sharp, copper tang of fresh violence one might expect from a crime so recent, but a thick, cloying stench of old iron mingled with the sour residue of coal smoke that had soaked into the velvet upholstery like a second, diseased skin. Inspector Timothy Thornton placed his boot upon the footboard of the first-class carriage, the movement hesitant enough to betray nothing to the constable waiting on Thea 3 degrees, yet speaking volumes to the trembling rhythm of his own pulse. His fingers closed around the doorframe. The wood felt cold and damp, with the morning mist rolling off the River Lee, and he pressed his thumb hard against the grain until the knuckle bleached to the color of wet chalk, anchoring his frame against a phantom lurch of the engine that existed solely in the memory of his brother's shattered body 3 years prior. "Keep the crowd back, Sergeant," Thornton commanded, his voice a low gravel that scraped against the silence of the empty compartment. "If I see a single newsman's hat breach that railing, you shall be walking the beat in Bermondsey before supper." The constable offered a jerky nod, shoving at the gathering press of onlookers whose faces appeared as pale smudges against the grey dawn, their breath plumed in the chill air as they craned for a glimpse of the space where a man had simply ceased to be. Thornton turned his gaze inward. The carriage sat stationary on Thetrack at Hackney Wick, a hollowed shell of mahogany and brass reeking of stale tobacco and primal fear. He moved deeper into the compartment, eyes narrowing as they swept the scene with the rigid, unblinking precision of a surveyor mapping a ruin. Shattered glass glittered upon the crimson seat. Tiny shards caught the weak light filtering through the remaining pane, scattering it across the floorboard swayre. A dark, viscous stain had already begun to coagulate, shifting from a shocking red to a dull, bruised purple. No body remained. Thomas Briggs was gone, removed perhaps to the mortuaria, simply cleared to make way for the machinery of inquiry, leaving behind only the evidence of his struggle. Thornton sank into a crouch, the fabric of his trousers pulling tight against his thighs, and inspected the leather strap of the window blind. It hung loose, torn from its fixture, and there, distinct against the warm black leather, lay the greasy impression of a thumb. Headed not touch it. Touch was to contaminate, and the yard had grown strict on such matters since the scandal of the previous decade, though the urge to trace the whirls off the print, to feel the texture of the killer's sweat, rose in him like a physical nausea. "Missing portmanteau," he muttered, the words hanging in the stagnant air, "and the watch chain gone clean." He straightened, his spine cracking with a sound that seemed too loud in the small space, and felt the familiar, itching urge tore up his thumb against his index finger, a tactile ghost of the old chain he knew would never hold. The railway company would call this an accident, a tragic slip during a moment of confusion, yet the violence here was deliberate, calculated with cold efficiency of the very engine that had carried the murderer away. The train hissed nearby, a distant mechanical beast exhaling steam that curled around the wheels of the carriage like spectral fingers, and Thornton flinched, a microscopic tightening of the shoulders quickly masked by adjusting his collar. Thule scratched his neck, rough and unforgiving, mirroring the irritation blooming in his chest. "Inspector!" The voice came from the platform, sharp and impatient. Thornton stepped back out into the open air, the relief of distance from the confined space washing over Heimven as the cold dampness of the embankment seeped through the soles of his boots. Matthew Roth stood waiting by the station master's office, a ledger clutched to his chest as if it were a shield against the intrusion of the law. The clerk's face was flushed, eyes shifting towards the gathering crowd before fixing on Thornton with a mixture of defiance and anxiety. "You have had your look, Inspector Thornton," Roth said, shifting the weight of the book in his arms. "The line is due to resume in 20 minutes. Do you intend to hold up the entire North London service for a ghost story?" "I intend to secure a manifest for the journey from Fenchurch Street to Hackney," Thornton replied, his tone flat, devoid of the theatrical anger Roth seemed to expect. "Every name, every ticket issued, and the roster of the guards." "That is impossible." Roth took a step forward, his shoes clicking on the wet pavement. "The books are in the city. To retrieve them, to cross-reference the passengers, it will take hours. You ask me to halt the engines for a phantom while the shareholders watch the receipts bleed dry. A financial calamity, sir, far worse than a single murder in a first-class carriage. A single murder, Thornton's eyes locked onto Theklerk's, the washed-out blue irises hardening. Ammon was thrown from Thai's train, Mr. Roth thrown, while the wheel turned and the passenger sat in their velvet seats. If the public believes this carriage is a slaughterhouse, your receipts will vanish regardless of me inquiries. Roth opened his mouth, a retort forming on his lips, but Thornton turned away, dismissing the argument with the sharp pivot of his heel. The clerk's panic was a luxury Thornton could not afford. The protocol demanded the list, and the list would be had, even if he had to tear the station master's office apart brick by brick. He walked towards the edge of the platform, the gravel crunching beneath his feet, and looked down the track, where thorough disappeared into the thickening fog. The iron lines stretched out, parallel and unyielding, vanishing into the grey void where the city swallowed light and sound alike. "Get the manifest," Thornton said over his shoulder, not waiting to see if Roth complied. The command hung suspended, a brittle thing that threatened to shatter against the indifference of the station. Roth did not move immediately. He stood frozen, the leather-bound ledger pressing into his ribs, as though it might offer protection from the man who had just turned his back on him. A gust of wind swept down the platform, carrying with it the acrid tang of sulphur and wet ash, lifting the hem of the clerk's coat to reveal trousers stained with the grime of the yard. "You mistake me for a servant, Inspector." Roth's voice lacked its earlier heat, replaced by a thin, reedy tremor that spoke of a man calculating losses rather than defending principles. He shifted the book to his left hand, freeing the right to wipe a smear of soot from his spectacles, a delaying tactic so transparent it almost invited pity. Almost. Thornton stopped at the edge of the canopy, where the shelter of the roof gave way to the open, weeping sky, and waited. He did not turn. To turn would be to engage, and engagement required energy he had already spent inside that carriage. "I mistake you for an obstacle," Thornton said to the fog. "Remove yourself or be removed. The choice is yours, but the outcome remains identical." A train groaned in the distance, the sound vibrating through the soles of Thornton's boots, a low-frequency thrum that set his teeth on edge. It was the approach of the next service, a mechanical inevitability that cared nothing for murder manifests or financial calamities. Roth made a sound, a sharp intake of breath that might have been a protest or a sob, before the click of his heels on the wet stone signaled his retreat towards the office. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the glass in its frame, a petty act of defiance that cost nothing and gained less. Thornton exhaled, the breath pluming white before him, and stepped off the platform onto the ballast. The ground here was uneven, a treacherous mix of sharp flint and slick mud that demanded total attention, forcing him to watch his step with a focus that bordered on the obsessive. This was good. The physical necessity of not falling kept the other thoughts at bay, the memories of his brother's twisted limbs and the coroner's dry voice speaking of industrial inevitability. He walked parallel to the tracks, moving away from the station, away from the crowd that still pressed against the railings like moths to a dying lamp. The fog thickened as he descended the embankment, clinging to his coat, dampening the wool until it felt heavy as lead on his shoulders. Here the world narrowed to the immediate sensory input, the smell of rotting vegetation, the hiss of escaping steam from a distant valve, the crunch of his own footsteps. He swept his gaze across the verge with methodical slowness. The police constables had combed the area earlier, searching for the body, but they had looked for a man, not a hat. They had looked for the tragedy, not the triviality. Thornton knew better. In the chaos of a violent death, the smallest discarded object often screamed louder than the corpse. He pushed through a cluster of nettles, the stinging leaves snapping against his wrists, and paused. Something dark lay tangled in the reeds near the water's edge, half submerged in the black sludge of the ditch. It was not a body. It was smaller, misshapen, devoid of the terrible stillness of human remains. Thornton dropped to one knee, ignoring the protest of his swollen joints, and reached out. His fingers closed around the object, pulling it free from the mud with a wet, sucking sound that echoed in the quiet air. A hat. Silk black, now ruined by the mire and the crushing weight of the earth. He held it up, turning it slowly in the grey light. The brim was bent, the crown dented as though it had been struck by a heavy boot or thrown with considerable force. But it was the band that drew his eye, that made his breath hitch in his throat. The silk ribbon was torn, jagged edges fraying where it had been ripped from the main body, yet a fragment remained attached, stiff with dried sweat and dirt. He brought it closer, squinting against the gloom. There, stamped in fading gold leaf upon the leather lining, was a name, J. Weiss, and beneath it an address in Cheapside, a German tailor. The connection snapped into place with the satisfying click of a lock engaging, a tangible thread in a city otherwise defined by its impenetrable fog. Thornton rubbed his thumb against the index finger of his left hand, the rough texture of the hat band grounding him, pulling him back from the precipice of his own anxiety. "Found you," he whispered, the words snatched away by the wind. He stood, pocketing the hat with a care that belied its wretched condition. It was evidence now, a witness that could not lie, unlike the passengers in the carriage or the clerks in the office. The weight of it in his coat pocket felt substantial, heavier than silk and mud had any right to be. It was the weight of a beginning, the first solid step in a chase that would likely end only when the noose tightened or the ship sailed beyond reach. Behind him the station bell rang, a clear, piercing note that cut through the damp air. The line was resuming. The machinery was winning. Roth would have his trains running on time, his shareholders pacified, his financial calamity averted for another day. They would all pretend that nothing had happened, that the carriage was just a carriage and the journey just a journey. But Thornton knew the truth. The iron beast had tasted blood, and it would not be sated by a simple timetable. He turned back towards the path, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, and began the climb back to the world of men. The fog swirled around his legs, obscuring the tracks, hiding the distance, but the direction was clear. Cheapside, a German tailor, a name on a ruined hat. The city stretched out before him, vast and unknowable, but for the first time since the alarm had been raised, Thornton felt the faint, cold stir of purpose. He adjusted his collar, the wool still scratching, the smoke still choking, and walked towards the waiting carriage that would take him back to London. There was work to be done, and the dead man's hat was waiting to speak. The climb back to the platform dragged at his calves, the mud acting as a second skin, slick and sucking, refusing to release its hold on his boots without a struggle. Thornton paused halfway up the embankment, one hand braced against the wet timber of a fence post, and waited for the wheeze in his chest to settle into something resembling a regular rhythm. The station bell had ceased its ringing, replaced by the low, building groan of the engine preparing to depart, a sound that vibrated through the soles of his feet and up into his shins. It was a physical demand, an insistence on movement that ignored the crime festering in the ditch below. He pushed off the post, forcing his legs to move, and crested the rise just as the first carriage began to lurch forward. Steam billowed from the release valve, a thick white cloud that swallowed the platform whole, obscuring the faces of the few remaining passengers who huddled near the ticket office. Thornton coughed, waving a hand before his face to clear the acrid fog, and spotted Roth standing by the edge of the platform, clutching a clipboard to his chest as though it were a shield against the law. The clerk's eyes darted towards Thornton, then away, fixing on the moving train with a desperate intensity. "You are resuming service," Thornton said, his voice flat, carrying easily over the hiss of the pistons, "before I have signed off on the line." Roth flinched, his shoulders hunching inward as if struck. He did not turn fully, keeping his profile to the inspector, his gaze locked on the departing wheels. "The delay has already exceeded the tolerance of the board, Inspector. We cannot hold the schedule for a search that yields nothing but mud." It yielded this. Thornton tapped the pocket of his greatcoat, the hard lump of the hat pressing against his ribs. "And it will yield more, provided you do not scatter the evidence across 3 counties by running your engines over it." "The manifest is in my office," Roth snapped, finally turning with a face pale and slick with sweat despite the chill. "Take it, read it, burn it for all I care, but the train leaves now. The public is waiting and they are frightened. Fear does not pay dividends, Thornton, punctuality does." A group of men in broadcloth coats surged forward as the steam thinned, eager to board, their boots clattering on the wood planks. They pushed past Roth, ignoring the clerk's protestations, driven by the primal need to be moving, to be anywhere but here. Thornton watched them, Noting the way they avoided looking at the spot where Briggs had fallen, their eyes fixed on the open doors of the carriages. "Stop them," Thornton ordered, stepping into Roth's path. "No one boards until I have the book." "I cannot," Roth whispered, the words trembling. "Look at them, they are tied. If I hold them back, they will tear the station apart." The first passenger, a heavy-set man with a grey beard, shoved past Thornton, his elbow catching the inspector's arm with a force that sent a jolt of pain through the old injury in his shoulder. Thornton stumbled, his hand flying out to grasp the lapel of the man's coat, but the momentum was too great. The man tore free, scrambling into the carriage, followed by two others. The door slammed shut with a definitive thud. "Damn you," Thornton growled, lunging for the handle, but the guard blew his whistle, a shrill, piercing shriek that cut through the air. The train gathered speed, the wheels beginning their rhythmic clatter against the rails, a sound that grew louder, more aggressive, drowning out Thornton's shouted commands. He stood frozen on the platform, watching the carriages slide past, the windows blurring into streaks of yellow light and dark glass. Inside, he could see the silhouettes of the passengers, sitting rigidly, staring straight ahead, pretending they were alone, pretending the blood on the velvet seats 3 cars back did not exist. Roth sidled up to him, holding out the clipboard with a shaking hand. "Here, take it, just let them go." Thornton snatched the clipboard, his fingers digging into the wood until the grain bit into his palm. He did not look at the clerk. He watched the tail lamp of the train disappear into the fog, a single red eye blinking out into the darkness. The noise receded slowly, leaving behind a ringing silence that felt heavier than the roar had been. "They are gone," Roth said, his voice devoid of triumph, hollowed out by exhaustion. "What will you do now?" Thornton looked down at the manifest. The pages were filled with neat, cramped handwriting, names and destinations listed in columns that offered no explanation for violence. J. Weiss, Cheapside, the name burned in his mind, a bright coal in the ash of the investigation. He turned the page, the paper crackling loudly in the quiet. "Now," Thornton said, adjusting his collar against the sudden draft that swept the platform, "I go to Cheapside." He tucked the clipboard under his arm, the wood pressing hard against his side, and began to walk towards the station exit. His boots left dark, muddy prints on the clean planks of the platform, a trail of the ditch that clung to him, marking his passage. Roth watched him go, saying nothing, alone on the platform as the next train began to whistle in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that promised more passengers, more fear, and more wheels turning over the iron bones of the city. Thornton did not look back. The hat in his pocket felt cold, a dead weight against his hip, pulling him towards the dark streets of London where a German tailor waited, unaware that the silence of the carriage had finally been broken. The bell above the door did not ring, a ring registered choked on a throat of rusted iron. Thornton pushed inside, and the heat struck him first, a physical wall of steam and damp wool that clung to his skin like a wet shroud. Gas jets hissed along the walls, casting long, trembling shadows over rolls of broadcloth stacked floor to ceiling, while the air tasted of singed fiber and the sharp, metallic tang of hot pressing irons. John Matthews sat on a stool near the rear window, a needle poised between thumb and forefinger, his head bowed over a waistcoat of grey merino. He did not look up when the inspector entered, though the needle stopped its work, hovering motionless above the fabric as if waiting for permission to pierce the cloth again. "Mr. Matthews," Thornton said. His voice sounded flat in the small room, absorbed by the layers of hanging garments. "I am busy, sir." The tailor's accent was thick, London clay rubbed smooth by years of dealing with gentlemen who demanded perfection but refused to wait for it. "Appointments are kept by book. Walk-ins are not accommodated." Thornton stepped forward, his boots leaving dark prints on the scrubbed pine floorboards. He reached into the pocket of his greatcoat and withdrew the hat. It was a hard black felt, the band stained with a grease that no solvent could lift, the brim crushed on the left side where it had been grabbed in panic. He placed it on the counter between them, the heavy lump settling with a dull thud. "Look at this." Matthews glanced at the hat, then back to his waistcoat. "I see many hats in this shop. None of them are mine to claim. This one was worn by a man who purchased an alteration from you 3 days ago. The band was shortened. The stitching was done in a hurry." Thornton leaned over the counter, his shadow falling across the tailor's hands. "I require the name of the customer." Matthews set the needle down. He wiped his fingers on a rag tucked into his apron, the movement slow, deliberate. "I cannot recall every face. Men come, men go. The city is large, Inspector, and my memory is not a ledger." The Metropolitan Police Act is quite specific regarding the concealment of felons. Thornton kept his tone level, devoid of the anger simmering beneath his ribs. To withhold information in a matter of murder is to invite charges of accessory. The penalty is transportation, perhaps hanging, should the court feel generous. A muscle twitched in Matthew's jaw. He looked at the hat again, his eyes tracing the line where the silk band had been unpicked and resewn. The thread was black, slightly uneven, a sign of haste rather than incompetence. "He was nervous," Matthews said softly. His hands shook. He pricked his own finger on the needle and bled on the lining. "I had to clean it before he would take the thing back." "His name?" "France," Matthews swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing against the collar of his shirt. He gave no surname, paid in sovereigns, counted them out one by one, as if he feared I might steal the count. Thornton rubbed the thumb of his left hand against his index finger, the skin rough and dry. And nothing else, no direction, no mention of where he intended to go. He spoke of America. Matthews reached for the needle again, then stopped, his hand hovering over the grey wool. He asked about the ships, which ones were fastest, which captains asked no questions. "Did he purchase anything else?" Matthews hesitated. The gas light flickered, casting a sudden jerk of shadow across his face. "A chain, heavy gold, Venetian style. He said he needed something of value that could be sold easily in New York." Thornton straightened. The information settled in his mind, heavy and cold. A gold chain was not easily disposed of in London without attracting the eye of a pawnbroker, and every broker in the city knew the constables who patrolled their streets. "Thank you, Mr. Matthews." As Thornton took the hat and slid it back into the depths of his coat, he issued a final command: "Do not leave the city." He would likely require the man's statement before the week was out. "I have work to do," Matthews muttered, picking up the waistcoat. His hands were shaking now, the needle trembling against the fabric. "The gentlemen will not wait for their clothes simply because you are chasing ghosts." Thornton turned and walked out into the street. The noise of Cheapside hit him like a blow, the rumble of cart wheels on stone, the shouted orders of draymen, the constant lowing of cattle being driven towards Smithfield. He paused on the pavement, his chest tight. A steam engine hissed at the curb nearby, a delivery wagon venting pressure, the white cloud curling around his boots. The rhythmic clatter of the machinery synced with his own shallow breathing, a mechanical pulse that drilled into his skull. He adjusted his collar, his fingers fumbling with the stiff fabric against his throat, fighting the sudden choking sensation that rose whenever the city's noise became too loud, too fast. The hat pressed against his hip, a dead weight pulling him towards the river. He looked down the street, towards the pawnshops of Clerkenwell. A gold chain would find its way there eventually, drawn by gravity and greed. Thornton began to walk, his boots striking the pavement in time with the distant whistle of a train, moving towards the next link in the chain that bound them all. The hat sat upon the counter, a black void in the center of the cluttered workspace. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of gaslight that pierced the gloom, settling upon the felt brim like grey snow. John Matthews did not touch it. He kept his hands upon the grey merino waistcoat, his fingers pressing the fabric flat, as if smoothing out the wrinkles might also iron out the intrusion of the law. Thornton waited. The silence in the shop was not empty. It was heavy with the scent of scorched wool and the sharp, metallic tang of hot irons resting in their stand. Steam curled from a kettle in the corner, joining the haze that clung to the ceiling beams. Outside, the rumble of Cheapside traffic vibrated through the floorboards, a constant reminder of the city's indifferent momentum. "Well?" Thornton asked. The word dropped into the room, flat and final. Matthews lifted his gaze, his eyes watery and rimmed with red, before looking at the hat, then the inspector, and finally back to the waistcoat. "I repair many bands," he said, noting how silk frays or sweat rots the leather, for it is a common task. Not this stitching. Thornton leaned forward, the fabric of his coat creaking. He did not touch the hat either. Protocol demanded evidence remain undisturbed until logged, though the urge to trace the uneven thread was a physical itch beneath his skin. The tension is wrong. The thread is black, but cheaper than you would use for a gentleman's commission, and it was done in haste. A muscle jumped in the tailor's cheek. He reached for a pair of shears, then thought better of it, letting his hand fall back to the apron. Haste is the currency of this district, Inspector. Men require things quickly. They pay for speed. They pay for silence, too. Thornton's voice remained low, a gravelly undertone that matched the distant shunting of trains at King's Cross. A man who bleeds on the lining does not wait for the cloth to dry. He wipes it. He hides it. You clean this band. Matthews flinched. The movement was slight, a tightening of the shoulders, but Thornton caught it. He saw the way the tailor's eyes darted towards the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. I clean all garments before return. It is service. You cleaned blood. As Thornton straightened, the joints in his knees popped. He rubbed his thumb against his index finger until the rough skin caught on the callus. A man wore this hat when he threw another from a moving carriage, and the friction of the fall crushed the brim while the panic of the flight stained the band. If you knowingly harbor a murderer, the Metropolitan Police Act is clear. You become an accessory. The penalty is not a fine. Matthews swallowed. His Adam's apple worked against the stiff collar of his shirt. He looked at the hat again, truly looked at it, seeing not the object, but the memory of the man who had worn it. The gas light flickered, casting a shadow that made the tailor's face appear hollowed, skull-like. He was terrified, Matthews whispered. The words seemed to cost him something, dragged out from a place of deep reluctance. His hands, they shook. When I handed him the needle to test the fit, he dropped it. He tried to sew the band himself to save time, and he pierced his thumb. The blood was dark. It soaked into the silk before I could stop it. His name? I do not know. Matthews shook his head, a quick, jerky motion. He gave no surname. He spoke German, but with an accent I could not place. He called himself France, nothing more. Thornton let the name hang in the air. France, a common name, yet specific enough to begin the narrowing of the net. He watched the tailor's hands. They were still now, resting on the grey wool, but Thornton remembered the tremor from moments before. Fear was a tangible thing in this room, thicker than the steam. Did he say where he was going? America. Matthews picked up the shears again, gripping them tightly, the metal gleaming in the dim light. He asked about the ships, the Victoria, the Java. He wanted to know which captain asked the fewest questions about manifests. He said he needed to be gone before the week ended. Thornton nodded slowly. The information aligned with the manifest logs. Roth had reluctantly surrendered. A flight across the Atlantic required capital, however. A man fleeing with nothing but the clothes on his back could not purchase a passage in the cabin class required for anonymity. Did he have the funds? Thornton asked. A passage to New York is not cheap. Matthews hesitated. He looked at the hat, then down at his own hands, stained with dye and chalk. He paid me in sovereigns, gold. He counted them out onto the counter, one by one. He did not trust me to take the purse. And the rest? There was more. Matthews lowered his voice, as if the walls themselves might carry the confession to the street. He showed me a chain, heavy, gold, Venetian work. He said he would sell it in London before he boarded to buy supplies. He said it was too distinctive to wear in New York. Thornton felt a shift in his chest, a cold settling where warmth should be. A gold chain was not merely currency, it was a beacon. In the pawnshops of Clerkenwell and Holborn, such an item would draw the eye of every broker and constable alike. It was a tether binding the fugitive to the city he sought to escape. Where did he say he would sell it? I do not know. Matthews met Thornton's gaze, his eyes wide and pleading. I swear it. He only said that gravity and greed would find it a home. Thornton stepped back from the counter. The interview was concluded. The evidence was logged in his mind, if not yet in the ledger. He reached out and took the hat, the weight of it familiar now, a dead thing returning to its keeper. Do not leave London, Mr. Matthews. I will send for you to formalize this statement." "I have customers," Matthews said, his voice regaining a fraction of its earlier defiance, though his hands still trembled against the waistcoat. "The winter season does not wait for the police." "Nor does the hangman." Thornton turned and walked towards the door. The bell above it jangled, a sharp, brittle sound that cut through the hum of the shop. He stepped out onto the pavement. The air outside was colder, thick with coal smoke and the damp breath of the river. A delivery wagon hissed at the curb, venting steam from its pressure valve, the white cloud wrapping around Thornton's boots like a shroud. He paused, letting the noise of the street wash over the cart wheels on stone, the shouts of the draymen, the lowing of cattle driven towards Smithfield. His breathing shallowed. The rhythmic clatter of the city synced with the pulse in his neck, a mechanical drumming that threatened to drown out thought. He adjusted his cravat, the stiff fabric choking him, fighting the sudden sensation that the fog was filling his lungs. The hat pressed against his hip, heavy and cold. He looked down the street towards Clerkenwell. A gold chain would move quickly through the shadows of London, drawn by necessity towards the light of the pawnbroker's window. Thornton began to walk. His boots struck the pavement in a steady rhythm, matching the distant whistle of a train, moving towards the next link in the chain that bound them all. The bell's jagged cry died against the brickwork, swallowed by the damp wool of the street. Thornton did not look back. To glance behind was to invite the shop's stale air to follow, to let the tailor's trembling hands reach out and snag his coat tail. He forced his gaze forward, fixing it on the grey smear of the pavement where a horse had recently dropped a steaming pile, the vapor rising in a thin, lonely column that dissipated before it could touch the low sky. Clerkenwell waited. He moved through the crowd not as a man parting water, but as a stone sinking through mud, heavy and inevitable. A drayman shouted at a team of shiers, the crack of his whip splitting the air with a violence that made Thornton's shoulders hitch upward, a reflexive flinch he suppressed by grinding his molars together until the pain bloomed in his jaw. The street smelled of wet ash and roasted chestnuts, a cloying sweetness that fought a losing battle against the sulfuric tang of the gasworks upwind. It was a smell that coated the throat, oily and persistent. Thornton rubbed his thumb against his index finger. The callus caught on the skin, a rough friction that grounded him. Gold chain. The words looped in his mind, not as a clue, but as a physical weight, dragging at the center of his chest. Men did not sell Venetian gold in the daylight. They waited for the gloom, for the shadows lengthening under the bridges, for the hour when honest men were counting their supper spoons and the desperate were counting their sins. An omnibus rumbled past, the iron tires biting into the stone, sending a vibration up through the soles of Thornton's boots that traveled straight to his knees. He stopped. The sensation was too familiar, a ghost of the collision that had taken his brother, the sudden, violent lurch of iron against iron that defied the natural order of things. He gripped the brim of his hat, his knuckles whitening, forcing himself to stand still while the vehicle groaned away, leaving a trail of coal dust in its wake. Breathe in, out. The air tasted of soot, real and present, not the cold vacuum of a carriage floor. He adjusted his collar again, the starched linen scratching against his throat, a futile attempt to clear the passage that felt increasingly narrow. The panic was a quiet thing, a small animal scratching at the ribs, not the roaring beast it had been 3 years ago on the platform at King's Cross. He could manage it. He had to. There was a chain to find, a man to hang, and a city that believed speed could outrun consequence. Thornton turned left onto Farringdon Road. The incline was slight, but his legs felt leaden, as if the mud of the street had seeped into his trousers and hardened. He watched the faces of the passers-by, searching for the telltale signs of a man carrying too much value in his pocket, a worker with a dinner pail, eyes fixed on the ground, a woman balancing a basket of turnips, her shawl pulled tight against the chill, a boy sweeping the gutter, his movements jerky and hurried. None of them looked like a murderer. None of them looked like France. That was the terror of it, the banality, the way evil wore a common coat and walked among the turnips. He passed a pawnbroker's shop, the 3 brass balls hanging dull and oxidized above the door. The window was cluttered with the debris of poverty, saws without handles, coats with elbow patches, silver spoons that had lost their partners. Thornton paused, his reflection ghosting against the glass, a grey smear superimposed over a pile of rusted tools. Inside, the gas jet flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the object seem to shift and writhe. If the chain was here, it would be buried, wrapped in rag, tucked behind the ledger, waiting for the broker to decide if the risk of holding stolen gold was worth the profit. But Matthews had said the man intended to sell it before boarding. Time was the enemy. The Victoria did not wait for the hesitations of conscience or the delays of the law. A figure emerged from the alley beside the shop, a man in a frock coat that had seen better decades, his face obscured by the upturned collar and the low pull of a cap. He moved with a furtive glide, avoiding the patches of light cast by the shop window, hugging the wall where the shadows were deepest. He carried nothing in his hands, but his posture suggested a burden, a careful guarding of something close to the body. Thornton's hand drifted towards the truncheon in his pocket, the wood smooth and warm from his body heat. He did not draw it, not yet. To draw was to escalate, and escalation brought attention, and attention allowed the prey to scatter. He watched the man's boots. They were well made, leather polished despite the grime of the street, but the heels were worn down on the left side, indicating a limp or a favoring of the right leg. The man stopped at the next corner, glancing left, then right, his movements quick and bird-like. He spotted a second pawnbroker, smaller, darker, the window bare save for a single watch chain draped over a velvet cushion. The stranger hesitated. His hand went to his inner pocket, fingers brushing the fabric, confirming the presence of the treasure. Thornton took a step. The cobblestone shifted under his boot, a small, grinding sound that seemed deafening in the relative quiet of the side street. The stranger froze. His head snapped around, eyes locking onto Thornton's. For a second, time suspended, the city holding its breath, the smoke hanging motionless in the air. Then the man ran. He did not sprint with the athletic grace of a fugitive in a penny dreadful. He scrambled, his legs pumping awkwardly, the limp worsening with every stride. He knocked into a woman carrying a bundle of laundry, sending white sheets billowing into the mud, a chaotic explosion of fabric that slowed him for a crucial heartbeat. "Stop!" Thornton's voice was low, lacking the theatrical boom of the stage, but it carried the weight of authority that cut through the street noise. "In the Queen's name." The command did not halt the man, it only drove him harder. He plunged into a narrow passage between two warehouses, the darkness swallowing him whole. Thornton followed, his breath catching in his throat, the old fear rising like bile. The passage was tight, the walls pressing in, smelling of rotting wood and stagnant water. He could hear the man's footsteps ahead, splashing in puddles, ragged and desperate. Thornton pushed forward, his shoulders scraping against the rough brick until the space narrowed, forcing him to turn sideways to fit as his chest compressed and the air grew thin. The sound of the footsteps stopped. Silence rushed in, thick and suffocating. He paused, listening, only the drip of water, the distant rumble of a cart on the main road, and the hammering of his own heart. He rubbed his thumb against his finger again, the motion frantic now. Think, the man could not have vanished. There was no exit at this end, only a dead end of stacked crates and a high wall topped with broken glass. Thornton moved forward, slowly, his hand finally closing around the truncheon. He rounded the final stack of crates. The alley was empty, except for a single item lying in the mud, discarded in the haste of flight. A glove, black leather, the fingertips stained with dye, and beside it, glinting faintly in the gloom, a link of gold, torn from a chain, shining like a cruel eye against the filth. Thornton stooped, his joints protesting, and picked up the link. It was warm. He turned it over in his palm, the metal heavy and undeniable. The man was close, cornered. Desperate men were dangerous, but they were also careless. The chain had broken, the tether had snapped, but the weight remained. He looked up at the high wall, the shards of glass jagged against the grey sky. The man had not climbed. There was no blood on the glass, no scuff marks on the brick. He had hidden, somewhere in the shadows of the crates, or perhaps in the cellar door that stood slightly ajar at the base of the warehouse wall, a dark mouth waiting to be fed. Thornton straightened, the gold link clenched in his fist. He could call for assistance, summon the local beat constables to surround the block. Protocol demanded it, safety dictated it, but protocol was slow, and safety was a luxury for those who did not chase ghosts through the fog. The Victoria sailed soon, Every minute spent waiting for backup was a minute gifted to France. He stepped towards the cellar door. The wood was rotting, the paint peeling in long, sickly strips. A faint sound emanated from within, a scraping, like a rat moving through straw, or a man trying to quiet his breathing. Thornton drew the truncheon. The wood felt solid, real. He pushed the door open with the toe of his boot, the hinges screaming in protest, a high, thin cry that echoed off the warehouse walls. The darkness inside was absolute, a void that seemed to pull at the light from the alley. "Come out," Thornton said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "There is nowhere left to run." The silence inside deepened, heavy and expectant. Then a match struck. The flare of sulfur illuminated a face for a split second, a pale, sweating, eyes wide with a terror that transcended language before the flame was blown out, plunging them both back into the dark. A scuffle ensued, the sound of bodies colliding, of breath expelled in a grunt of pain. Thornton lunged forward, into the black, into the smell of damp earth and fear, ready to meet the violence head-on. The sulfur stench of the extinguished match hung heavy, a choking cloud that scratched at the back of Thornton's throat and masked the sweeter, coppery tang of fresh blood. He did not lunge blindly into the void where the face had bloomed and vanished, for the darkness was a terrain he knew better than the sunlit streets of White-Capelle. Instead, he dropped to one knee, the damp earth seeping instantly through the worn wool of his trousers, and pressed his palm flat against the ground. Vibration. A shuffling scrape, faint as a moth against glass, moving left towards the stacked barrels. "Stay still," Thornton said, the words low, gravel grinding on gravel. "You break a leg in here, France, and I shall drag you out by the ankles. The mud does not care for your pride." No answer came, only the wet suck of a boot pulling free from the sludge, a sound that betrayed the man's position as clearly as a shout. Thornton shifted his weight, feeling the truncheon heavy in his right hand, a comforting lump of wood against the panic trying to claw its way up his windpipe. The cellar was a throat, deep and constricting, and he was the bone stuck in its gullet. He inhaled, forcing the air down past the tightness in his chest, counting the seconds between the scrapes. 1, 2, 3. The man was crawling, trying to silence his own movement, unaware that the silence itself was a beacon. Thornton moved. He did not rush. Rushing belonged to the young constables who broke their shins on cobblestones and missed their marks. He flowed forward, a shadow detaching itself from the greater dark, his left hand sweeping the space ahead until his fingers brushed the rough stave of a barrel. Cold, damp, and behind it, the heat of a body huddled against the brickwork. "I have you," Thornton whispered, though he knew the lie was for himself as much as the fugitive. He swung the truncheon, not with a wild arc, but with a short, brutal jab aimed at the space where the heat radiated. The wood connected with flesh, a dull thud that jarred his wrist, followed immediately by a gasp that sounded like a bellows collapsing. The man recoiled, crashing into a stack of tin plates that clattered to the floor, a chaotic symphony of metal on stone that shattered the quiet. "God save us," a voice croaked from the darkness, not the Germans, but higher, trembling with a terror that had nothing to do with the law. "It's not me, I swear on my mother's grave, it's not me." Thornton froze, the truncheon raised. That was not France Matilde a quarter Lilla's voice. The German spoke with a clipped precision, even in fear. This was the whine of a cornered rat, a local accent thick with gin and desperation. The match fled again, this time held by a hand that shook so violently the flame danced like a dying star. It illuminated a face gaunt and bearded, eyes wide, and reflecting the firelight like a hunted animal's, but it was not the face from the wanted broadsheets. It was younger, softer, the features blurred by grime and tears. "Who are you?" Thornton demanded, the question snapping out before he could temper it. "Where is the German?" The man scrambled backward, heels skidding in the muck, as he pressed himself into the angle where wall met floor. "He went out," he gasped. "Back way, through the coal chute, gone before you kicked the door in, officer, I tell you true." "Liar," Thornton stepped closer, the light from the match casting long, wavering shadows that made the cellar walls seem to breathe. "You were hiding with him, smell of tobacco on your coat, same brand as the stub found in the carriage." The man flinched as if struck, dropping the match into the mud where it hissed and died, plunging them back into absolute blackness. "I didn't know," he said. "It was just a watch, just a bit of gold to fence. He didn't say nothing about throwing a man off a train, not until we got to the alley. Thornton's hand shot out, gripping the man's collar, yanking him forward until the smell of stale ale and sour sweat filled his nose. The fabric was rough, cheap wool, damp with the cellar's chill. The coal chute, where does it empty? The basin, the man stammered, his hands fluttering uselessly at his sides because he was afraid to push back yet equally afraid to stay still. Limehouse, the Morning Star is taking coal, and he said he'd blend with the crew. His voice cracked as he pleaded, "Please, Governor, I got kids." He gestured desperately towards the ceiling, explaining that 3 of them waited in the room upstairs. Sarah Guppy knows, ask her. The name landed like a physical blow, shifting the axis of the chase. Guppy, the lodging house on Flower and Dean Street. Thornton released the collar, letting the man slump back into the filth, his mind already racing ahead, mapping the route from this stinking hole to the river. The German was not just running, he was evaporating, using the city's own infrastructure to dissolve into the crowd. "Get up," Thornton ordered, his voice devoid of pity. "You are coming with me. If you have lied about the chute, I will leave you in this hole until the rats eat the flesh from your bones. If you speak true, you might see your children before the month ends." He grabbed the man's arm, hauling him to his feet. The fugitive was dead weight, stumbling, sobbing softly, a broken thing that offered no resistance. Thornton dragged him towards the sliver of grey light marking the cellar door, the gold link still burning a hole in his pocket. The chase had changed. It was no longer a sprint through alleys, it was a race against the tide and the timetable. They emerged into the alley, the evening air suddenly sharp and clean compared to the rot below. Thornton paused, looking towards the east, where the sky was bruising purple over the docks. The Morning Star, coal lights, a ship ready to sail. He could hear the distant whistle of a steam engine, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to echo the hollowness in his own chest. "Walk," he commanded, shoving the man forward. "And do not think to run. My legs are older than yours, but my patience is dead, and that makes me faster." They moved out of the passage, merging into the flow of pedestrians on the main road, 2 shadows among many. Thornton kept a firm grip on the man's arm, his eyes scanning the faces passing by, searching for the familiar limp, the Germanic cut of a coat, the cold stare of a killer who believed he had already won. The city swallowed them, indifferent to the justice being dragged through its mud, indifferent to the blood drying on the tracks miles away. But Thornton knew the rhythm of it now. The train would stop, the ship would wait, and he would be there, standing on the platform, watching the steam clear, ready to close the hand around the throat of the new century. The man stumbled on a loose cobblestone, muttering a prayer to a god Thornton had long since stopped listening to. Inspector Thornton did not look down. He looked only forward towards the river, where the fog was beginning to rise off the water, thick and yellow as old bruise, hiding the path to the sea. The stairs to Flower and Dean Street did not creak. They complained, a low, woody groan that announced every shift of Thornton's weight long before his boot found the next tread. He dragged the sobbing man up behind him, the fugitive's heels scraping against the rotting wood, leaving dark trails of cellar muck on the varnish that had worn away decades ago. The air in the stairwell was thick, a solid thing composed of boiled cabbage, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, acrid tang of something recently burnt. It caught in Thornton's throat, coating the back of his tongue with a flavor like old pennies left in the rain. He did not cough. He simply tightened his grip on the man's sleeve, the rough wool bunching under his fingers, and pushed upward into the gloom of the first-floor landing. A single gas jet sputtered overhead, its mantle fractured, casting a sickly yellow light that failed to reach the corners of the hallway where shadows pooled like spilled ink. Thornton kicked at the door marked "Scullery," the wood splintering slightly around the latch. "Open now." Silence from within, not the quiet of an empty room, but the held breath of someone trying to cease existing. Thornton shoulder-checked the door. It swung inward, hitting a stack of tin basins that clattered to the flagstones, the noise exploding in the small space. Sarah Guppy stood by the cast-iron range, her back to them, her shoulders hunched as if warding off a blow. She did not turn. Her hands were buried deep in an apron pocket, knuckles white against the grey fabric. The smell here was overwhelming, a heavy, choking cloud of singed cotton and something sweeter, darker, that made Thornton's stomach turn over. Ash drifted from the stove's grate, settling on the hem of her skirt like grey snow. "Mrs. Guppy," Thornton said, his voice flat, stripped of any greeting, "you have been busy." She turned then slowly, her face a map of deep lines carved by worry and the perpetual damp of White-Capel. Her eyes, small and dark, darted past Thornton to the man trembling in his grip, then flicked to the stove, then back to the inspector. There was no surprise in her look, only a grim resignation, the expression of a woman who knows the bill has come due. "I know nothing of what you speak, Inspector," she lied, her voice raspy, dry as dust. "I am about my washing. The boy spilled the coals, that is all." "The boy," Thornton repeated, stepping into the room. The heat from the stove hit his shins, uncomfortable through his trousers. He released the fugitive, shoving him against the wall where he slid down to a crouch, wrapping his arms around his knees. "The boy who is not here, the man who was here, the one whose shirt you are currently turning to smoke." Guppy flinched. It was a small movement, a twitch of the jaw, but it told him everything. She reached into her apron pocket, her hand emerging empty, then shoved it back in, fingers working against something hidden there. "It was stained," she whispered, the words tumbling out fast and desperate as blood covered everything, soaking the sleeves and collar until she knew she could not keep it in her house. The tenants would smell it. They would know. "You have destroyed evidence of a capital crime," Thornton said, closing the distance between them. He could see the soot on her cheeks, the way her chest heaved beneath her bodice. "Do you know what the penalty is for an accessory, transportation, or the rope?" "I burned it," she cried out, her composure cracking. Yanking her hand from her pocket, she thrust it towards him, her palm opening to reveal 3 brass buttons, tarnished and dull, linked by a fragment of charred thread. "I took these, before the fire took the rest." She hesitated, confessing that she had thought foolishly she could sell them for the roof, which leaks something terrible when the rain comes hard. Thornton stared at the buttons. They were small, insignificant things, yet they carried the weight of the dead man in the carriage. He reached out, not touching her skin, but plucking the metal from her palm. The brass was still warm, holding the heat of the fire that had consumed the rest of the garment. He rolled them between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the rough edge where the thread had been burnt away. "A poor bargain," he murmured. 3 buttons for a hanging. Action segment. Guppy sank onto a wooden stool, her hands clasping her knees, her head bowing. "God is not taking statements tonight, Mrs. Guppy." Thornton pocketed the buttons, the metal clicking softly against the gold link already there. The sound was final. "Who helped him leave? The man in the cellar says he went to the basin, to the Morning Star." Guppy looked up, her eyes wide, reflecting the flickering gaslight. Fear had replaced the guilt now, a primal terror that had nothing to do with the law. He spoke of a runner, a man who knows the tides, said he could get him aboard before the whistle blew. "Name?" Jem the rat. He drinks at the Anchor and Hope, down by the lock, near the coal barges." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a hiss, her eyes darting to the dark corner of the scullery. "But you must be quick, Inspector. The German," he said something before he left, something that made my blood run cold. Thornton paused, his hand on the doorframe. "What did he say?" "Attempt 1. He said the train carries the dead faster than the living can follow." As she spoke, she shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill of the memory, and he laughed. It happened while the shirt burned. He laughed. Thornton felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the phantom sensation of the carriage lurching beneath his feet. He pushed it down, burying it under the procedural need for movement. There was no time for ghosts, only for timetables and tide charts. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice hard. "Do not leave this room. If I find you gone, I will bring the constables back to strip this house brick by brick." He turned, grabbing the fugitive by the arm and hauling him up from the floor. The man whimpered, but did not resist, his legs shaking so violently he could barely stand. Thornton dragged him back into the hallway, the smell of burnt fabric clinging to his clothes, a scent that would not wash out easily. Down the stairs, out into the street. The fog had thickened, rolling off the river in dense, yellow waves that swallowed the gas lamps whole. Somewhere to the east, a steam whistle blew, long and low, the sound vibrating in the soles of Thornton's boots, the morning star coaling up, ready to sail. He looked at the fugitive, whose face was pale and slick with sweat. The anchor and hope, how far? 10 minutes, the man stammered, pointing a trembling finger towards the haze. If we run, if the tide is right. Thornton did not run. He walked, a steady, relentless pace that forced the other man to stumble after him. The city was a maze of shadows and noise, but the path was clear now. A name, a place, a ship. The German thought he could vanish into the smoke of the engine, into the anonymity of the ocean. He was wrong. The iron tracks ended at the water, but the pursuit did not. Thornton adjusted his collar, the starch stiff against his neck, and stepped into the fog, moving towards the river where the water waited, black and cold, to carry them all to the end of the line. The brass lay in Thornton's palm, dull against the creased skin, still holding the ghost of the stove's heat. 3 buttons. A fragment of charred thread clung to the shank of the largest, black and brittle as a burnt matchstick. He did not speak immediately. The silence in the scullery was not empty. It was heavy with the scent of scorched wool and the wet, mineral smell of the river seeping through the foundations. Guppy watched his hand, her eyes fixed on the metal as if it might bite. "A poor bargain," Thornton said at last, his voice low and grinding like a millstone. 3 buttons for a hanging. Guppy sank onto the wooden stool, the legs scraping harsh against the flagstones. She clasped her knees, her knuckles white, the bodice of her dress rising and falling with the quick, shallow rhythm of panic. "He said he was a sailor, said he got into a fight in a pub." Her words tumbled out, desperate to fill the space between them. "I did not know about the train. I swear to God, Inspector, I did not know." "God is not taking statements tonight, Mrs. Guppy." Thornton closed his fist around the buttons, the metal edges pressed into his flesh, a sharp, grounding pain. He pocketed them, the brass clicking softly against the gold chain link already resting in his waistcoat, a sound that felt final, like a lock tumbling shut. "Who helped him leave?" "The man in the cellar says he went to the basin, to the Morning Star." Guppy looked up. The gaslight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the corners of the room seem to shift. Fear had replaced the guilt now, a primal terror that had nothing to do with the law. It was the fear of the thing she had housed, the thing that had burned the shirt and laughed while the fabric curled into ash. "He spoke of a runner," she whispered, leaning forward until the stool creaked under her weight. "A man who knows the tides, said he could get him aboard before the whistle blew." "Name?" Jem the rat," she swallowed, her throat working. "He drinks at the Anchor and Hope down by the lock, near the coal barges." She paused, her eyes darting to the dark corner of the scullery where the shadows were thickest. "But you must be quick, Inspector. The German," he said something before he left, something that made my blood run cold. Thornton paused, his hand on the doorframe. The wood was rough under his palm, splintered and damp. "What did he say?" "He said the train carries the dead faster than the living can follow." She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself as if against a sudden draft. "And he laughed. While the shirt burned, he laughed." A familiar tightness seized Thornton's chest, the phantom sensation of the carriage lurching beneath his feet, the sudden, violent shift of weight that had taken his brother. He pushed it down, burying it under the procedural need for movement. There was no time for ghosts, only for timetables and tide charts. The railway was iron and steam, not a spectre, yet the city treated it like a beast that demanded blood. "Stay here," he ordered. His voice was hard, stripping away the weariness that threatened to slump his shoulders. "Do not leave this room. If I find you gone, I will bring the constables back to strip this house brick by brick." He turned, grabbing the fugitive by the arm. The man whimpered, a wet, ragged sound, but did not resist. His legs shook so violently he could barely stand, his weight dragging against Thornton's grip. Thornton dragged him back into the hallway, the smell of burnt fabric clinging to his clothes, a scent that would not wash out easily, something that would settle into the wool and stay there until the garment rotted. Down the stairs, the floorboards groaning under their combined weight, out into the street where the fog had thickened, rolling off the river in dense yellow waves that swallowed the gas lamps whole. The light was reduced to halos of sickly sulfur, illuminating nothing but the immediate dampness of the pavement. Somewhere to the east, a steam whistle blew, long and low, the sound vibrating in the soles of Thornton's boots. The Morning Star coaling up, ready to sail. He looked at the fugitive, whose face was pale and slick with sweat, the skin translucent over the bone. The anchor and hope, how far? 10 minutes, the man stammered, pointing a trembling finger towards the haze. If we run, if the tide is right. Thornton did not run. He walked, a steady, relentless pace that forced the other man to stumble after him, scrambling to keep up with the long, measured strides. The city was a maze of shadows and noise, cart wheels clattering on cobbles, the distant shout of a dockhand, the hiss of escaping steam, but the path was clear now. A name, a place, a ship. The German thought he could vanish into the smoke of the engine, into the anonymity of the ocean, believing distance was a shield. He was wrong. The iron tracks ended at the water, but the pursuit did not. Thornton adjusted his collar, the starch stiff against his neck, chafing the skin, and stepped into the fog, moving towards the river where the water waited, black and cold, to carry them all to the end of the line. Coal dust coated the back of Thornton's throat, gritty and dry, tasting of burnt earth. He did not run. Running invited panic, and panic bred mistakes in the arithmetic of pursuit. Instead, he lengthened his stride, a rhythmic, loping gait that forced the fugitive to scramble, legs pumping awkwardly to match the inspector's relentless pace. The fog rolled off the Thames in thick, yellow billows, swallowing the gas lamps until they were nothing more than bruised oranges hanging in the sulfur air. "Keep up," Thornton grunted, the words tearing from a chest tight with the phantom pressure of steam. The man stumbled, his boot catching on a loose cobble near the gutter, but Thornton's hand shot out, gripping the collar of the man's coat before he could fall. The wool was damp, heavy with the river's breath. They turned a corner, the narrow alleyway opening onto the wider expanse of the Limehouse Basin, where the silence of the waiting water clashed with the industrial roar of the docks. There it stood, the Morning Star, a black hull rising from the murk, smoke belching from its funnel in great, choking plumes that merged with the low-hanging clouds. The paddle wheels churned slowly, testing the water, ready to push the vessel out towards the open sea and the freedom of the Atlantic. 10 minutes, the fugitive wheezed, doubling over as they reached the edge of the quay. He pointed a shaking finger towards the gangplank, where a crowd of stevedores and passengers milled about, their forms indistinct in the gloom. He said the runner would be near the ticket booth, by the crane. Thornton pushed past him, his eyes scanning the throng. The clock on the station master's office ticked loudly in his mind, each second a hammer blow against the fragile order of the investigation. 4 minutes. The departure whistle would sound in 4 minutes, and once that steam engine engaged fully, the gap between justice and escape would widen into an ocean. He flashed his badge at a gatekeeper blocking the entrance to the goods line, the metal cold against his palm. "Police business. I need passage on the next goods train to the docks. Now." The gatekeeper, a stout man with a face lined by years of coal smoke, barely glanced at the insignia. He looked instead at the pocket watch dangling from his own waistcoat, tapping the glass face with a thick finger. "Timetable says the passenger line goes first, Inspector. Rules are rules. Company policy." "Policy," Thornton's voice dropped, a low rumble that mimicked the distant shunting of engines. "A murderer is boarding a ship. Move the barrier, or I will have you charged as an accessory before the fact." The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Thornton's grim face and the approaching headlight of the passenger train, which hissed into the station with a shriek of breaking iron. The steam engulfed them, hot and wet, smelling of oil and human sweat. Thornton watched the carriages glide past, windows fogged, faces obscured, a river of humanity flowing away from him while the true target slipped through the cracks. He felt the familiar nausea rise, a cold slickness in his gut that had nothing to do with the smell of the station. It was the motion. Even standing still, the vibration of the tracks beneath his boots triggered the memory. The splintering wood, the sudden, violent lurch. His brother's face, pale and still, amidst the wreckage of the carriages 3 years prior. The coroner had called it an industrial inevitability, a statistic to be filed away, but Thornton remembered the crunch of bone against iron, the way the world had tilted on its axis and never righted itself. He gripped the edge of a wooden crate, his knuckles white, forcing the image down as he commanded himself to breathe in and out, while the air tasted of ash. Next train, The gatekeeper shouted over the hiss of the departing passenger engine. "Goods line, 5 minutes." "Too late," Thornton muttered, but he was already moving, pushing through the crowd towards the goods siding where a slow, jarring locomotive waited, coupled to a string of open wagons laden with crates of tea and bales of cotton. He climbed aboard, the metal rungs of the ladder biting into his palms. The engine lurched forward, a violent, shuddering start that knocked him off balance. He stumbled, catching himself on a stack of wooden boxes, the rough wood scraping his cheek. The rhythm of the wheels was wrong, irregular, a clatter-thump that synced perfectly with the hammering of his own heart. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, and the darkness brought the vision back. The twisted axles, the blood on the ballast, the silence that follows a scream. He opened them quickly, focusing on the swaying lantern hanging from the roof of the cab. Focus on the light, not the motion. The journey was a blur of jerking stops and starts, the train groaning under the weight of its cargo as it navigated the complex web of tracks leading to the deeper docks. Thornton stood rigid, his body braced against the sway, every muscle tense to resist the phantom pull of the crash. When the train finally screeched to a halt near the Morning Star's berth, he jumped down before the wheels had fully ceased turning, his boots hitting the gravel with a jarring impact that shot pain up his shins. He scanned the quay. The crowd had thinned, most passengers already aboard or retreated to the warmth of the waiting rooms. But there, near the base of the crane, a figure stood hunched over, exchanging a small satchel for a ticket with a man in a peaked cap. The runner, Jem the Rat. Thornton broke into a run, the nausea forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that burned in his lungs. "Stop," he bellowed, the command cutting through the ambient noise of the dock. The figure looked up, eyes wide in the lantern light, and then bolted, diving into the surging crowd of late boarders. Thornton plowed after him, shoulder-checking a woman carrying a basket of groceries, sending apples rolling across the wet planks. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric of the runner's coat, but the man twisted away with the agility of a rat, slipping between two burly stevedores who blocked Thornton's path. "Out of the way," Thornton roared, shoving the men aside, but the delay was enough. The runner merged with the flow of people moving up the gangplank, disappearing into the shadowed belly of the ship. Thornton stopped at the foot of the plank, chest heaving, his hand hovering over the truncheon at his belt. He could board, search every cabin, every hold, but the ship was scheduled to sail within the hour. Without a warrant specific to the vessel, without the cooperation of the captain, he would be stalled by bureaucracy while the Morning Star slipped its moorings. He looked down at the deck where the runner had stood. Something fluttered in the wake of the departing crowd, caught against a cleat by the wind. Thornton stepped forward, picking it up, a scrap of paper, greasy and torn. He smoothed it out under the light of a nearby lamp. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, SS Victoria. Not the Morning Star, Adiki. The real escape was on the faster liner, the one that left from the main terminal, not the coal berth. The runner had been a diversion, a sacrifice to buy time. Thornton crumpled the paper in his fist, the edges digging into his palm. The whistle of the Morning Star blew, a long, mournful note that signaled departure. The paddle wheels began to turn, churning the black water into foam. He had lost the runner, but he had the destination, the Victoria. He turned back towards the station, the taste of coal dust heavy on his tongue, the rhythm of the tracks calling to him again. The chase was not over. It had merely changed tracks. "Goods line, 5 minutes." Thornton did not answer. He moved. Pushing through the crowd required a specific kind of violence, not the swing of a truncheon, but the steady, unyielding pressure of a shoulder against soft wool and rigid bone. Clerks bound for the city scattered, clutching valises and bonnets, muttering curses that died in the thick air. He reached the goods siding where the locomotive waited, a black beast coupled to a string of open wagons laden with crates of tea and bales of cotton that smelled of dust and distant ports. Iron rungs bit into his palms as he climbed. The engine lurched forward. A violent, shuddering start knocked him off balance. He stumbled, catching himself on a stack of wooden boxes, the rough wood scraping his cheek. Splinters dug into the skin, blood welled, warm and sticky, but he ignored it. The rhythm of the wheels was wrong, irregular, a clatter-thump that synced perfectly with the hammering of his own heart. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Darkness brought the vision back. Twisted axles, blood on the ballast, the silence that follows a scream. He opened them quickly, focusing on the swaying lantern hanging from the roof of the cab. Focus on the light, not the motion. Sweat pooled in the hollow of his throat, cold despite the heat radiating from the boiler. His breath shallowed, a wheezing intake that clashed with the steady rhythm he tried to maintain. The journey blurred into jerking stops and starts. Train groaned under the weight of its cargo as it navigated the complex web of tracks leading to the deeper docks, each curve pulling at his stomach like a hook in flesh. Thornton stood rigid, his body braced against the sway, every muscle tense to resist the phantom pull of the crash. 3 years. It had been 3 years since the coroner called his brother's death an industrial inevitability, a statistic to be filed away, yet the memory remained fresh as a wound picked open by dirty fingernails. He remembered the crunch of bone against iron, the way the world had tilted on its axis and never righted itself. Coal smoke filled his lungs regardless of his location. He adjusted his grip on the crate, thumb rubbing against the index finger, a tactile mimicry of feeling the texture of evidence like the gold chain or the hat band. Grounding himself, when the train finally screeched to a halt near the Morning Star's berth, he jumped down before the wheels had fully ceased turning. His boots hit the gravel with a jarring impact that shot pain up his shins. He staggered, regained footing. The quay stretched out before him, a landscape of shadow and gaslight. Most passengers had already boarded or retreated to the warmth of the waiting rooms, leaving the open space to the stevedores and the stray dogs picking at refuse. Thornton swept his gaze across the area, his washed-out blue eyes holding a fixed, weary focus that seemed to look through the darkness rather than at it. There, near the base of the crane, a figure stood hunched over. The man exchanged a small satchel for a ticket with another man in a peaked cap. The transaction hurried, furtive. The runner, Jem the Rat. Thornton broke into a run. The nausea vanished, replaced by a surge of energy that burned in his lungs, sharp and clarifying. "Stop," he bellowed, the command cutting through the ambient noise of the dock. The figure looked up, eyes wide in the lantern light. Then he bolted, diving into the surging crowd of late boarders who clustered near the gangplank. Thornton plowed after him, shoulder-checking a woman carrying a basket of groceries. Apples rolled across the wet planks, red spheres spinning into the gutter. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric of the runner's coat, but the man twisted away with the agility of a rat, slipping between two burly stevedores who blocked Thornton's path. "Out of the way," Thornton roared. He shoved the men aside, but the delay was enough. The runner merged with the flow of people moving up the gangplank, disappearing into the shadowed belly of the ship. Thornton stopped at the foot of the plank, chest heaving, his hand hovering over the truncheon at his belt. He could board, search every cabin, every hold, but the ship was scheduled to sail within the hour. Without a warrant specific to the vessel, without the cooperation of the captain, he would be stalled by bureaucracy while the Morning Star slipped its moorings. He looked down at the deck where the runner had stood. Something fluttered in the wake of the departing crowd, caught against a cleat by the wind. Thornton stepped forward, picking it up. A scrap of paper, greasy and torn. He smoothed it out under the light of a nearby lamp. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, SS Victoria. Not the Morning Star, a decoy. The real escape was on the faster liner, the one that left from the main terminal, not the coal berth. The runner had been a diversion, a sacrifice to buy time. Thornton crumpled the paper in his fist, the edges digging into his palm. The whistle of the Morning Star blew, a long, mournful note that signaled departure. Paddle wheels began to turn, churning the black water into foam. He had lost the runner, but he had the destination. The Victoria. He turned back towards the station, the taste of coal dust heavy on his tongue, the rhythm of the tracks calling to him again. The chase was not over. It had merely changed tracks. The guard shoved the door open with a boot heel, revealing a cabin that smelled of wet wool and old grease. Thornton stepped inside, the floorboards vibrating beneath his soles before the engine had even begun to move. He did not sit. Sitting implied rest, and rest suggested a journey undertaken for pleasure rather than duty. He stood near the window, fingers digging into the wooden frame, knuckles whitening as the locomotive ahead, released a violent burst of steam that obscured the platform in a white, scalding cloud. "Keep the door shut, Inspector," the guard said, wiping his hands on a rag that was darker than the grime it removed. "Draft pulls the fire something fierce on this old girl." "See that I am at the basin before the tide turns," Thornton said. His voice sounded thin in the small space, swallowed by the low thrum of the metal walls. "We go when we go. Schedule is God out here." The guard slammed the door, the latch clicking with a finality that sealed Thornton in with the scent of oil and impending motion. The train lurched. It was not the smooth, progressive acceleration of the passenger line, where cushions absorbed the shock and velvet curtains dampened the noise. This was a collision of iron against iron, a series of violent jerks that transmitted directly through the soles of his boots and up into the hinge of his jaw. Thornton swayed, catching himself on the window ledge. Outside, the gas lamps of the station slid past, elongating into streaks of sickly yellow before vanishing into the dark. The rhythm established itself immediately, a heavy, laboring clatter that felt less like travel and more like a mechanical seizure. He closed his eyes. Mistake. Darkness removed the horizon, leaving only the sensation of the carriage swinging on its springs. The motion hooked into his stomach, a physical hand twisting the gut. He swallowed hard, forcing the bile back down. It tasted of copper and stale tobacco. His breath shallowed, a wheezing intake that clashed with the steady rhythm he tried to maintain. The air in the cabin grew thick, heated by the boiler nearby, yet his skin prickled with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. 3 years. The number sat in his head, heavy and immutable. 3 years since the coroner called his brother's death an industrial inevitability. A statistic, a line in a ledger noting that progress demanded a toll in flesh. Thornton opened his eyes, forcing himself to look at the passing darkness, but the reflection in the glass showed only his own grayish pallor, the washed-out blue eyes holding a fixed, weary focus that seemed to look through the night rather than at it. The wheels hit a gap in the track. The carriage jumped. A wooden crate shifted in the corner, sliding across the floor with a grating screech that set his teeth on edge. Thornton flinched, his hand flying to the truncheon at his belt, before he remembered there was no enemy here, only the machine. He rubbed the thumb of his left hand against the index finger, a tactile mimicry of feeling the texture of evidence like the gold chain or the hat band, grounding himself. The motion was unconscious, a nervous tick born of too many nights walking the embankments of the Thames instead of sleeping. "Steady," he whispered. The word vanished into the clatter. He remembered the sound of the crash, not the explosion but the crunch, splintered wood against bone, the way the world had tilted on its axis and never righted itself. He had stood on that ballast just as he stood now, watching the engineers measure the skid marks while the body lay covered under a sheet that was already turning pink at the edges. They had told him it was a coupling failure, a momentary lapse in pressure, nothing that could be prevented, only mourned. But Thornton knew better. The machine did not care about mourning. It consumed time and distance, and if a man fell beneath the wheels, the schedule remained intact. A sudden deceleration threw him forward. He slammed against the window frame, shoulder taking the impact. Pain flared, sharp and bright, but it served to clear the fog clouding his mind. He gripped the ledge, nails scraping against the painted wood. Outside, the speed dropped. The rhythmic clatter slowed to a ponderous groan as the train navigated a complex web of points and switches, each curve pulling at his stomach like a hook in flesh. They were approaching the docks. The smell changed. The coal smoke thinned, replaced by the briny rot of the river, the tang of creosote, and the sweet, cloying scent of rotting fruit from the market warehouses. Thornton wiped his face with a handkerchief that was already damp. He adjusted his collar, a futile gesture against the choking sensation that seemed to fill his lungs regardless of his location. The train groaned under the weight of its cargo metal protesting against metal as the brakes were applied with a squeal that pierced the night. It stopped. The silence that followed the engine's cut was not true silence, but a sudden absence of the specific noise that had filled his head for the last 20 minutes. Thornton waited for the dizziness to pass. He could not afford to stumble on the platform. Not now. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the night air, which was colder than the cabin, but no cleaner. The guard was already there, lantern swinging in his hand. "Basin, stop," the man said, not looking at Thornton. He was checking the couplings, hammer tapping against the iron links. "You're on your own from here." "Stay close," Thornton said. "I may need you to hold the engine." "Not paid for waiting," the guard spat into the gravel, adding that the train leaves in 10 because it is the captain's orders. "Then you will wait." Thornton's voice dropped, losing the weariness, gaining the edge of authority that made clerks tremble in their offices. "This is a metropolitan inquiry. You wait." The guard paused, hammer hovering. He looked at Thornton, then at the badge pin to the lapel of the worn coat. He grunted, a sound of reluctant compliance, and turned back to the coupling. Thornton did not watch him. He turned towards the quay. The landscape stretched out before him, a topology of shadow and gaslight. Cranes loomed like skeletal birds against the low cloud cover. Stevedores moved in clusters, their voices low and indistinct, carrying bales and boxes towards the waiting ships. Most passengers had already boarded or retreated to the warmth of the waiting rooms, leaving the open space to the workers and the stray dogs picking at refuse. Thornton scanned the area, his gaze sweeping the shadows near the base of the crane. There, a figure stood hunched over, exchanging a small satchel for a ticket with another man in a peaked cap. The transaction was hurried, furtive. The man in the cap glanced towards the train, then shoved the ticket into his pocket and turned away. The figure with the satchel began to move towards the gangplank of the nearest steamer. Thornton broke into a run. The nausea vanished, replaced by a surge of energy that burned in his lungs, sharp and clarifying. He did not think about the protocol. He did not think about the warrant. He thought only of the distance between himself and the man in the coat. His boots hit the gravel, the uneven surface threatening to turn an ankle, but he pushed through the pain. The chase was not over. It had merely changed tracks. The door of the telegraph office flew open with a violence that sent the bell above it spinning wildly against the glass. A frantic, brassy shriek that cut through the low murmur of clerks tapping out commodity prices. Thornton stumbled in, the momentum of his run from the docks carrying him 3 paces past the threshold before he caught himself on the edge of a high wooden counter, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps that smelled of river mud and coal dust. The air inside was thick, a visible soup of ozone and the sharp, acrid scent of overheated insulation, clinging to the back of the throat like swallowed smoke. "Inspector!" Elias Vane looked up from a ledger, his face pale in the gaslight, a quill frozen mid-stroke above a column of figures. He was a small man, neat in his waistcoat, with eyes that darted too quickly between Thornton's disheveled state and the pocket of his own coat, where the shape of illicit letters pressed against the fabric. "New York," Thornton said, slamming his hand flat on the counter. The impact jarred the inkwells, sending a ripple through the black fluid that threatened to spill onto the pristine logbook. "The Victoria, she docks at dawn. You must send the warrant now." Vane blinked, the quill trembling slightly. "Sir, the line is reserved for commercial traffic until midnight. The Atlantic cable has a queue of shipping manifests longer than my arm, and I cannot simply cut in because you are out of breath." "This is not about breath." Thornton leaned forward, the weariness in his bones momentarily eclipsed by the feverish need for action, his washed-out blue eyes locking onto the clerk's evasive gaze. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the evidence bag, the coarse linen containing the gold chain recovered from the German tailor's lodgings. He slapped it down beside his hand, the metal links clinking softly against the wood, a sound that seemed absurdly delicate in the tension-filled room. "This chain belonged to a man thrown from a moving train. The wearer is on that ship. If he steps onto American soil before we have the warrant, he vanishes into a continent the size of God's own forgetfulness." Vane stared at the chain. The gold glinted dully under the jet, a serpent coiled in the bag. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in a throat that suddenly looked too tight for his collar. The secret letters in his pocket felt heavy, burning against his thigh, but the sight of the murder evidence, the tangible weight of a life ended violently, shifted the calculus in his mind. The risk of being caught smuggling correspondence paled against the charge of being an accessory to a felon who had slipped through his fingers. "The operator is in the back," Vane said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he stood up, knocking his stool back with a screech. He was just about to sign off. "Then wake him up." Thornton pushed off the counter, his legs shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to curdle into exhaustion. "Tell him it is a matter of life and death. Tell him if he delays, the blood is on his hands as much as the murderer's." Vane hurried around the end of the counter, his movements jerky with nervous energy, and disappeared through a beaded curtain that led to the inner sanctum. Thornton remained standing, gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white, the swollen joints protesting the strain. He could hear the faint, rhythmic clicking coming from the back room, the sound of the key tapping out dots and dashes, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to mock the irregular thumping of his own chest. It was a strange thing, to stand in a quiet room in London while words raced beneath the ocean, faster than any horse, any train, any ship could ever hope to travel, carrying the fate of a man who was currently sleeping in a cabin thousands of miles away. The clicking stopped. Vane reappeared, his face flushed. "He is sending it, but Inspector, you must understand, even if they receive it, the New York police are not under your command. They may choose to act, or they may choose to wait for official diplomatic channels. The wire is fast, but justice is slow." "I do not need justice to be fast," Thornton said, his voice rough, the gravelly register scraping against the silence of the office. "I need the ship held, I need the gangplank raised, nothing more." He turned away from the counter and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the fog had rolled in thicker, swallowing the street lamps until they were nothing more than diffuse halos of yellow light, floating in a void of grey. He watched the condensation form on the pane, tracing the path of a single droplet as it slid down, distorting the view of the world beyond. The telegraph wire stretched out from the roof of the building, a thin, dark line disappearing into the mist, connecting this room to a world he could not see, could not touch, could not control. It felt like a tether attached to a balloon, fragile and prone to snapping in the slightest gust of wind. Minutes stretched into an hour. The clock on the wall ticked with a ponderous slowness, each second a distinct, heavy drop of water falling into a deep well. Vane sat at his desk, pretending to work, but his eyes kept flicking to the curtain, then to Thornton's rigid back. The operator emerged finally, holding a slip of paper that looked insignificantly small for the weight of the news it carried. "Reply from New York," the operator said, his voice flat, devoid of triumph or sorrow. He placed the paper on the counter and stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag as if cleansing himself of the transaction. Thornton turned, snatching the paper before Vane could reach for it. The handwriting was jagged, rushed. "Ship detained AT quarantine stop passengers, disembarking under supervision stop no sign, of Marlilla stop man matching description. Seen boarding coastal steamer, 4 Boston 2 hours ago stop false name, given stop trace lost." The paper crumpled in Thornton's fist. "Gone," he whispered, the word barely audible over the hum of the instruments. "He is gone." Vane leaned forward, peering at the crumpled ball of paper. "Boston, he is heading north." "He is heading anywhere but here." Thornton straightened his spine, the movement stiff, as if his joints were rusted. The frantic energy that had driven him from the docks had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow ache in the center of his chest, a void where the hope of a cleaner rest had been. He looked at the telegraph machine, the brass keys gleaming innocently in the gaslight. It was a marvel, this device that could speak across the ocean, yet it had arrived too late, a whisper trailing behind a shout. The new age promised speed, connection, the collapse of distance, but all it had done was allow a murderer to slip further away, to trade the fog of London for the vast, unpoliced expanses of a new world. "The ship," Thornton said, his voice regaining its measured tone, though it lacked its usual authority. "Did they hold the Victoria?" "Yes, sir. Quarantine flag is up. No one else leaves until the health inspector signs off." "Good." Thornton turned towards the door, the bell giving another wild shriek as he pushed it open. The cold air rushed in to meet him, biting at his face, carrying the smell of the river and the distant, rhythmic clatter of the trains that never stopped, never waited, never cared about the men who chased shadows across the water. "Keep the line open, Vane. If he surfaces in Boston, I want to know before the ink is dry on the manifest." "And if he doesn't?" Vane asked, the question hanging in the ozone-thick air. Thornton paused on the threshold, his hand resting on the frame, the wood rough and splintered under his palm. He did not look back. The fog outside seemed to press against the doorway, eager to swallow him whole. Then we chase him until the wheels fall off the world, he said, and stepped out into the grey, leaving the clicking of the machine behind him, a futile countdown to a justice that was already sailing away. The door clicked shut, severing the ozone tang of the Telegraph office from the damp rot of the street. Thornton stood on the pavement, the grit of London grinding against the soles of his boots as he drew a breath that tasted of wet coal and horse dung. The fog did not part for him. It pressed in, a physical weight that soaked into the wool of his coat, turning the fabric heavy and cold against his shoulders. He walked. Not with the purposeful stride of a man hunting, but with the shuffling gait of one who has forgotten where he is going. The gas lamps above were mere smudges of sickly yellow, unable to pierce the grey curtain that had descended upon the city. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, a long, mournful cry that seemed to echo the hollow ache in his chest, vibrating through the cobbles and up into his bones. He turned left towards the river, drawn by the instinct to find something solid in a world that had suddenly become fluid and ungraspable. The Thames was a black ribbon unspooling into the dark, its surface oily and reflecting nothing but the void above. A barge drifted past, silent as a hearse, the crew invisible within the hold, leaving only the sound of water lapping against wood to mark their passage. Thornton leaned against the iron railing, the metal biting into his palms through his gloves. He looked down at the water, imagining the body of Thomas Briggs floating there, bloated and silent, the gold chain still missing from his neck, the watch still ticking in some pocket deep beneath the silt. "You look like a man who has lost more than a suspect," a voice said from the shadows behind him. Thornton did not turn immediately. He knew the cadence of that voice, the slight lisp that betrayed a childhood spent in the rookeries of St. Giles. Detective Sergeant Miller stepped into the pool of light cast by the nearest lamp, his face gaunt, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He held a clay pipe in one hand, unlit, twisting it nervously between his fingers. "The wire reached New York," Thornton said, his voice flat, stripped of the gravel that usually gave it weight. "Ma tilde a quarter is gone." "Gone?" Miller moved closer, the dampness of his coat brushing against Thornton's sleeve. "You mean dead, or gone as in vanished?" "Boarded a steamer for Boston. False name. The New York police are chasing a ghost while the real man sails north." Thornton pushed himself away from the railing, the iron groaning under his weight. "We held the Victoria, but the bird had already flown the coop hours before our message arrived." Miller let out a low whistle, the sound sharp and brittle in the heavy air. "Boston, that is a wide country, Tim, wider than England, Scotland and Wales put together. How do you propose to find one man in all that space?" "I do not know." The admission tasted like ash. Thornton rubbed his thumb against his index finger, the tactile mimicry of feeling the texture of the hatband, the gold chain, anything solid, anything real. "The technology, it moves faster than we can. We send words across the ocean in minutes, but a man takes weeks to cross it. By the time we arrive, he is already gone again." "Then we stop chasing the man and start chasing the paper," Miller said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He needs money, he needs papers, he cannot live on air and false names forever. He will try to pawn the watch, or the chain. If they are not on his person, he has hidden them, or sold them." "He would not sell the chain," Thornton said, the thought forming slowly like ice on a pond. "It was the prize, the reason. To take it was to win. Men like Ma tilde a quarter do not sell their trophies, they keep them close, to feel the weight of what they have stolen." "Or he sells it to buy passage further west," Miller countered, lighting his pipe finally, the match flaring bright and brief in the gloom. "San Francisco. The gold rush is still pulling men like moths to a flame. A gold chain buys a lot of tickets in '64. Thornton watched the smoke curl from Miller's lips, dissipating instantly into the fog. "We need to check the pawn shops, everyone from Whitechapel to Cheapside, and the jewelers. Someone may have seen it. A German make, distinctive." "I'll start the rounds at first light," Miller said, clapping a hand on Thornton's shoulder. The gesture was heavy, grounding. "You go home, Tim. You look like you're about to collapse. You cannot chase a ghost if you are dead on your feet." "Home," Thornton repeated, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. His rooms were cold, filled with the silence of a man who talks only to suspects and report books. "Yes, perhaps." He turned back towards the street, the direction of his lodgings suddenly unclear. The city had shifted around him, the landmarks obscured by the mist. The rhythmic clatter of the railway, usually a comfort in its predictability, now sounded like a countdown, a relentless ticking of a clock that was running out of time. He took a step, then another, his boots scraping against the wet pavement. "Tim," Miller called out, his voice fading slightly as the fog swallowed the sound. "Don't let him win by making you tired, for that is how they get you. They outrun your sleep, not your legs." Thornton raised a hand in acknowledgement, not looking back. He walked into the grey, the fog closing ranks behind him, erasing his footprints as soon as they were made. The city breathed around him, vast and indifferent, a machine of brick and mortar that chewed up men and spat out stories. He thought of the telegraph wire stretching out beneath the ocean, a thin thread of copper connecting him to a justice that was already slipping away. It was a fragile thing, that connection, easily snapped. Easily ignored. A carriage rattled past, the wheels splashing through a puddle, sending a spray of muddy water onto his trousers. He did not flinch. He just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, moving through the silence that was not silence at all, but the hum of 1,000 lives continuing regardless of one man's failure. The pursuit had changed. It was no longer a sprint across decks and platforms. It was a slow, grinding march across continents, fueled by paper and hope, and the stubborn refusal to let the wheels fall off the world. He reached the corner of his street, the familiar outline of his building emerging from the mist like a shipwreck. The gas lamp outside his door flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for him. He fumbled in his pocket for his key, his fingers numb and clumsy. The lock turned with a stiff click, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. He stepped inside, closing the door against the fog, but the cold remained, settled deep in his marrow, a reminder that some things once lost are never truly found. Upstairs, the report book lay open on his desk, the ink still wet where he had stopped writing hours ago. He sat down, the chair creaking under his weight, and picked up his pen. The nib hovered over the paper, trembling slightly. Then, with a jagged, hurried scrawl, he began to write again, the words flowing like blood from a wound, documenting the loss, the chase, the endless, grinding machinery of justice that never stopped, even when the man it sought was already sailing away. The clock on the mantel struck 2. The sound was dull, muffled by the layers of wool and fog. Thornton did not look up. He just wrote, the scratch of the pen the only sound in the room, a tiny, frantic noise against the vast, silent indifference of the night. Outside, a train screamed, a long, lonely cry that faded into the distance, leaving nothing but the echo and the dark. The door of the Electric Telegraph Company office slammed shut, cutting the Liverpool wind to a dull whistle behind him. Thornton stood on the threshold, hat dripping onto the checkerboard tiles, lungs burning with the taste of coal smoke and wet wool. He had traveled north on the evening express, a blur of dark fields and flickering gas lamps that did nothing to quiet the rhythm of the chase. Now the air inside smelled of ozone, hot metal, and the sharp acidity of battery fluid. It was a scent that clung to the back of the throat, chemical and intrusive. Elias Vane sat behind a high counter, sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms dusted with copper filings. He did not look up immediately. The key in his hand tapped against a brass plate, a rhythmic, idle motion that grated against Thornton's nerves. "Attempt 1. We are closing for the night, Inspector." Vane's voice landed flat, it lacked. "Then repair them." Thornton stepped forward, placing his gloved hands on the counter. The wood was worn smooth by the elbows of 1,000 clerks. "I have a warrant for the detention of the SS Victoria. She docks at Quarantine tomorrow morning. If that message does not reach the harbour master before she ties up, the man walks." Vane finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were red-rimmed, the pupils dilated from hours spent staring at the ticking needles. He weighed the illicit letters in his pocket against the grim authority of the Metropolitan Police, a calculation visible in the tightening of his jaw. "It is not a matter of will, It is a matter of current. Vane gestured to the apparatus behind him, a sprawling network of wires and coils that looked like the innards of a clockwork beast. The signal degrades over distance. We send words, not men. You ask me to push a signal across an ocean where the cable lies in the dark, subject to the whims of pressure and corrosion. Thornton reached into his coat. He did not produce the warrant. Instead, he slammed the description of the gold chain onto the counter. The paper slid across the polished surface, stopping inches from Vane's inkwell. It was a rough sketch, charcoal smudged at the edges, depicting the links with forensic precision. "This was taken from a dead man's neck," Thornton said. His voice was low, gravelly, mimicking the distant rumble of the underground railways he distrusted. "He was thrown from a carriage while it moved. The man who took it is on that ship. If you do not send this, you are an accessory." Vane stared at the sketch. The silence stretched, filled only by the erratic clicking of the instruments on the desk, a sound resembling a ticking clock that was running too fast. He picked up the paper, the edges crinkled under his thumb. "Sit down," Vane said, turning to the key. "Do not speak while I transmit, for the rhythm must be clear." Thornton moved to the bench along the wall. The wood was cold through his trousers. He watched Vane's fingers work. They moved with a dexterity that bordered on the unnatural, striking the key with a force that sent shocks through the table. Click-clack, pause, click. The sound was sharp, percussive, each note a pulse of information traveling faster than any man could pursue. It was a language of interruptions, a code of breaks and connections that bypassed the physical limitations of flesh and bone. Thornton rubbed the thumb of his left hand against the index finger. The tactile mimicry grounded him. He felt the texture of the hatband in his mind, the gold chain, anything solid, anything real. The telegraph wire stretched out into the fog, invisible beneath the Atlantic, a thin thread of copper connecting him to a justice that was already slipping away. It was a fragile thing, that connection, easily snapped, easily ignored. He thought of the railway, the iron tracks that allowed a murderer to vanish between stations. Technology facilitated the crime as efficiently as it transporting the pursuer. The click of the key accelerated. Vane leaned into the machine, his shoulder hunched, transmitting the urgency of the moment through the electric pulse. Thornton's breathing shallowed. He could hear the wheezing intake clash with the steady rhythm of the transmission. "Stop," Thornton said. Vane's fingers hovered. "The message is not complete." Segment 1, dialogue. The description, the chain, emphasize the weight, 20 pennyweights, German make. Current, 5 short fragments. Problem, violates, never more than 2 short sentences in a row. Fix, combine some into longer structures while keeping the word's meaning intact. Draft 1, the description, the chain, 2 short, combine next ones. Emphasize the weight, 20 pennyweights, German make. Vane nodded once. He resumed tapping. The clicking sound resumed, filling the room, a mechanical heartbeat that counted down the seconds until the ship docked. Thornton watched the wire stretch out into the fog in his mind's eye, feeling helpless as the message traveled faster than any man could pursue. He was bound by the actual procedures employed by Scotland Yard, the specific evidence of the hat and chain, yet he stood in a room filled with magic that he did not understand, relying on a machine to do the work of a truncheon. The transmission ended. Vane slumped back in his chair, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag stained with ink. "It is sent," Vane said, "and now we wait for the acknowledgement, which could be minutes or could be hours." Thornton walked to the window. The glass was thick, distorted by the heat of the room. Outside, the Liverpool docks were obscured by the night, the masts of the ships invisible ghosts in the mist. He pressed his hand against the pane. The cold seeped through the glove. "Hours," Thornton repeated. The word tasted like ash. He turned back to the room. The apparatus sat silent now, the needles still. The silence was not empty, it was heavy with the potential of failure. He thought of the report book waiting in his lodgings, the ink still wet where he had stopped writing. He thought of the endless, grinding machinery of justice that never stopped, even when the man it sought was already sailing away. "Will you notify me when the reply comes?" Thornton asked. Vane was already cleaning the key, the rag moving in circular motions over the brass. "There is a telegraph office at your hotel. We will route it there." Thornton nodded. He adjusted his collar, a futile gesture against the choking sensation of coal smoke that seemed to fill his lungs regardless of his location. He walked to the door. The handle was cold brass. He turned it. "Inspector," Vane called out. Thornton paused, hand on the latch. "If he is not on the manifest," Vane said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "the wire will not bring him back. You know this." "I know," Thornton said. He stepped out into the night, where the wind hit him immediately, carrying the smell of salt and tar. He pulled his coat tight. The pursuit had changed. It was no longer a sprint across decks and platforms, but a slow, grinding march across continents, fueled by paper and hope, and the stubborn refusal to let the wheels fall off the world. As he walked towards the hotel, his boots struck the pavement with a rhythm that matched the telegraph key, a frantic, ticking noise that followed him into the dark, while the city breathed around him, vast and indifferent. He kept walking. The reply would come, for it had to. The ink refused to dry. Thornton held the extradition warrant flat against the railing, pressing his thumb into the damp fiber until the paper threatened to tear, yet the script remained wet, glistening like oil on water. Salt spray misted over the gunwale, stinging his cheeks, but it did nothing to clear the cold taste from his mouth. That flavor had settled in the back of his throat weeks ago, back in London, and no amount of Atlantic air could scour it away. It sat there, gritty and permanent, a sediment of the city he carried wherever the train or ship deposited him. Constable Higgs shifted his weight beside him. The deck planks groaned under the man's boots, a rhythmic complaint that matched the rolling of the vessel. "The captain says we'll make Liverpool by tide," Higgs said. He kept his eyes on the horizon, where the grey sea merged with a sky of identical color. "If this wind holds." Thornton did not look up from the paper. He traced the signature of the American magistrate with a gloved finger, feeling the indentation of the nib rather than the ink itself. "The wind rarely holds for justice," Thornton said. His voice came out low, nearly swallowed by the slap of water against the hull. "It's the prisoner, sir. The men are uneasy." Higgs turned then, pulling his collar up against the bite of the breeze. "They say he speaks to himself in the hold, recites scripture, or maybe it's German." "Let him speak." Thornton folded the warrant. The crease was sharp, definitive. Words cost nothing. It is the objects that condemn him. He pocketed the document. The motion required balance. The ship lurched suddenly to port, throwing his center of gravity off kilter. Thornton stumbled, his hand shooting out to grip the rigging. The rope was coarse, tarred, biting into his palm. For a second, the sensation vanished, replaced by the phantom vibration of iron wheels on a track. His stomach tightened. The vestibular confusion was immediate, a sickness that had nothing to do with the sea and everything to do with the memory of sudden, mechanical violence. He closed his eyes. The world tilted. "Sir," Higgs stepped forward, hand hovering near Thornton's elbow. Thornton shoved the feeling down. He forced his eyes open, focusing on the grain of the wood beneath his feet, solid, unmoving relative to the ship. "I am well," Thornton said. He released the rigging, his palms strung where the tar had scraped the skin. "It is merely the motion. It's a heavy swell. It is the expectation of the drop." Thornton rubbed the thumb of his left hand against the index finger. The tactile mimicry grounded him. He needed the texture of evidence, the weight of the chain, the band of the hat, something that existed outside the sway of the ocean. Here on the water, nothing was fixed. The horizon shifted. The deck rose and fell. It was a poor substitute for the rigid certainty of the railway line, yet it provoked the same nausea. He thought of Matilda, a quarter lilla below, shackled in the dark, perhaps feeling the same roll of the hull, perhaps calculating the distance to the gallows with the precision of a tailor measuring cloth. Higgs spat over the side. The spittle vanished into the foam. "Newgate waits," Higgs said. "Calcraft is ready." "Calcraft is always ready." Thornton turned from the rail. The movement made the cold taste surge, bitter and acrid. The public wants a spectacle. They want to see the end of it. "And do you, sir?" Thornton looked at the constable. Higgs was young, his face still possessing the unlined optimism of a man who believed the law protected the innocent rather than merely processing the guilty. Thornton envied him the simplicity. "I want the report filed," Thornton said. "I want the ledger balanced." "That's not an answer." "It is the only one I have." He walked towards the hatchway leading below decks. The stairs were steep, iron grating that clanged under his boots. Each step resonated through the soles of his feet, a dull thud that echoed in his shins. He paused at the top. The smell rose to meet hemobilge, unwashed bodies, the sour tang of fear. It was thicker than the smoke of White-Capel, more intimate. Down there the air did not move. It stagnated. "Stay here," Thornton said. "I will speak to him alone." "Regulations say 2 officers. Regulations also say I am in charge of this prisoner." Thornton descended the first few steps. The light from the deck faded immediately, swallowed by the shadows of the hold. "Keep the sea off the papers, Higgs. If they wet, the magistrate will find cause to delay." "So?" Thornton continued down. The darkness pressed in. He could hear the shift of cargo in the lower hold, crates sliding slightly as the ship rolled. It sounded like bones settling. He reached the landing and stopped, letting his eyes adjust. A lantern swung gently on a hook, casting long, erratic shadows against the bulkhead. In the corner, a figure sat on a crate, hands bound, head bowed. Matilda, a quarter-liller, did not look up. He was polishing something with a rag. Thornton stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The prisoner stopped moving. He held the object up to the light. It was not the chain. It was a button, brass, tarnished. "They took the watch," Matilda, a quarter-liller, said. His English was precise, clipped, devoid of the accent Thornton had expected. "They took the chain. They left me this." "It is enough," Thornton said. "Is it?" Matilda, a quarter-liller, turned the button over. His thumb rubbed the surface, back and forth, a nervous tick that mirrored Thornton's own. "You chase the metal. You do not ask why the hand reached out." Thornton stood still. The ship groaned around them, a massive iron beast breathing in the water. "The court asks," Thornton said. "The court asks for a neck to fit the rope." Matilda, a quarter-liller, looked up then. His eyes were pale, washed out, holding a fixed, weary focus that seemed to look through Thornton rather than at him. "You think this ends when I swing? You think the silence returns?" Thornton felt the cold taste again, stronger now. He gripped the strap of his satchel. "The law ends it," Thornton said. "The law is just another machine." Matilda, a quarter-liller, dropped the button. It hit the wood with a dull click. "And machines break, or they run on without us." Thornton reached for the lantern. The metal was cold. He lifted it, bringing the light closer to the prisoner's face, searching for the tremor of a lie beneath the surface of the broadcloth coat. He found only stillness. "Stand up," Thornton said. "We dock at dawn." Matilda, a quarter-liller, rose. The shackles chimed, a small metallic sound that carried too far in the confined space. "Tell me, Inspector," Matilda, a quarter-liller, said, stepping into the light. "When you hear the train now, do you hear the wheels, or do you hear the drop?" Thornton did not answer. He turned towards the stairs. The hook of the question snagged in his mind, taking root where the doubt had been waiting. He climbed. The lantern swung in his hand, casting his own shadow ahead of him, long and distorted on the wall. He reached the deck. The air hit him, cold and wet. Higgs was waiting. "Everything settled, sir." Thornton looked at the horizon. The grey line was unbroken. "Prepare the transfer," Thornton said, "and burn the rag he was using." "So?" "It holds grease." Thornton walked to the rail. He looked down at the black water rushing past. "I want nothing of his on this ship when we land." Higgs nodded, though he did not move immediately. He watched his inspector, seeing the way Thornton's hand trembled slightly as it rested on the iron railing, the way his breathing shallowed against the rhythm of the sea. "Right away, sir." Thornton listened to the constable's boots retreat. He remained at the rail. The ship cut through the water, relentless, driven by steam and pressure. He thought of the button in the hold, the brass disc left behind. A small thing, insignificant, yet it weighed more than the warrant in his pocket. He closed his hand into a fist. The knuckles swelled white against the grey sky. The cold taste remained. It would remain until the rope tightened, or perhaps even after. He turned from the sea. The land waited. The machinery of justice required fuel. The horizon darkened not with night, but with a bruise of cloud that swallowed the grey line whole. Thornton remained at the rail, the iron cold enough to burn the palm if held too long. He did not move. The ship pitched, a sudden lurch that threw his weight against the stanchion. His stomach turned over, not from the motion itself, but from the memory of Eta, the sudden, mechanical lurch of a train leaving the tracks, the scream of metal on stone that had taken his brother 3 years prior. He gripped the rail, the knuckles whitened. "Wind's picking up, sir." Higgs stood in the shadow of the funnel, his cap pulled low against the spray. "Captain says we might see a gale before midnight." "Let it blow." Thornton did not turn. The cold taste in his mouth thickened, coating the tongue like ash. "So long as she holds." "She's iron, sir. She'll hold." Iron cracks. Thornton pushed away from the rail. His legs felt unsteady, the deck tilting beneath his boots as if the solid world had decided to tilt on its axis. He walked towards the cabin, each step a negotiation with gravity. The ship groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the soles of his feet and settled in his teeth. It was the same frequency as the carriages on the North London line, the same hum that haunted his insomnia. He stopped at the cabin door. The handle was brass, tarnished by salt. He turned it. Inside, the air was stale, trapped with the smell of wet wool and oil. He sat at the table. The extradition papers lay before him, corners curling in the damp. He smoothed them with a hand that trembled just slightly. The ink was dry, black and final. France M.A. tilde a quarter lila. The name looked insignificant on the page, a smudge of letters that weighed less than the button in the hold. He reached for his pen. The nib scratched against the paper, a harsh sound in the quiet room. He needed to file the report. The ledger required balancing. A crash from above shook the cabin. A bottle rolled from the shelf, smashing against the wall. Glass scattered across the floor, glittering like shards of ice. Thornton flinched. His breath hitched shallow and rapid. He closed his eyes. The room swam. It was not the ship moving, it was the ground falling away. He pressed his hands flat against the table. Wood grain, solid, real. "Inspector," Higgs stood in the doorway, water dripping from his coat onto the floorboards. "You should come up. The weather is turning." "I am working." "The papers can wait." Higgs stepped inside, bracing himself against the doorframe as the ship rolled heavily to port. "The captain wants all hands secure, and the prisoner." Thornton looked up. The lantern light caught the exhaustion in his eyes, the grayish pallor of a man who had not slept in days. "What of him?" "He's singing." Higgs frowned, shifting his weight as the floor tilted. "Down in the hold, loud." Thornton stood. The movement was abrupt, forcing him to grab the table edge for support. The room steadied, but the sensation of falling lingered in his gut. "Singing what?" "Hymns, I think, or maybe a folk tune. It's hard to tell through the bulkheads." Higgs wiped water from his face. "It's unnerving the crew, sir. They say he's calling down the storm." "Superstition." Thornton picked up his hat. The brim was stiff, the greasy ring of smoke visible even in the dim light. "He is a tailor, not a prophet." "He sounds like one." Higgs held the door open. "Come up, please." Thornton moved past him. The corridor narrowed, the walls closing in as the ship groaned again. He climbed the stairs. The air on deck was violent, whipping his coat around his legs. Rain fell in sheets, cold and biting. He squinted against the spray. The funnel spat black smoke into the wind, the sparks extinguished immediately by the deluge. He walked to the rail. The sea was black, churning with whitecaps that rose and fell like breathing chests. "He is trying to rattle us," Thornton said. His voice was low, almost lost in the wind. "He knows the evidence is solid. The chain, the hat, the blood." "The button," Higgs corrected. He stood close, shouting to be heard. "You said it was a button." Thornton gripped the rail. The metal vibrated under his fingers. "It is part of the same whole, a fragment of the crime." "It's a button, sir." Higgs leaned in. "Don't let him make you doubt the weight of it." "I do not doubt." Thornton looked out at the darkness. There was nothing to see but the water and the sky merging into a single void. "I doubt the machine." "The ship." "The law," Thornton turned away from the rail. The motion of the deck made him stumble just once. He recovered quickly, straightening his coat. It grinds men down. Some deserve it, some do not. That's not police talk, Inspector. It is the truth of it. Thornton walked towards the hatch. The rain soaked his hair, plastering it to his forehead. Keep the watch doubled. I want no accidents before we dock. Liverpool. By dawn, Thornton paused at the hatchway. The darkness below waited, mouth open, if the sea permits. He descended. The stairs were slick. He held the rail not for support but to feel the vibration of the hull. It was constant, a thrumming reminder of the engine below, the power that drove them forward regardless of the storm. He reached the landing. The singing had stopped. The hold was silent, save for the shift of cargo and the slap of water against the iron skin. He walked to the cell. M.A. Tilda a quarter Lilla sat on the crate, head bowed again. The button was gone. Where is it? Thornton asked. M.A. Tilda a quarter Lilla looked up. The pale eyes were clear, untroubled by the storm raging above. In my pocket, safe. It is evidence. It is mine. M.A. Tilda a quarter Lilla tapped his chest. You have the chain, you have the hat, you have the blood. Let me keep the button. Thornton stood in the doorway. The lantern swung, casting shadows that danced across the prisoner's face. You will hang for it. I know, M.A. Tilda a quarter Lilla smiled. It was a small, tight expression that did not reach his eyes. But I will not swing alone. The railway swings with me. Thornton felt the cold taste surge, bitter and acrid. He turned away. The hook of the statement snagged in his mind, taking root where the doubt had been waiting. He climbed the stairs again. The air hit him, cold and wet. The storm was breaking. The rain had lessened to a drizzle. In the distance, a light flickered on the horizon. Land. Higgs, Thornton called. The constable appeared from the shadows. Prepare the transfer and send a wire to London. So, tell them we are coming. Thornton looked at the light. It grew brighter, steady against the dark. Tell them the machinery is ready. Higgs nodded. Right away, sir. Thornton watched him go. He remained at the rail. The ship cut through the water, relentless. He thought of the button in the hold, the brass disc left behind, a small thing, insignificant, yet it weighed more than the warrant in his pocket. He closed his hand into a fist. The knuckles swelled, white against the grey sky. The cold taste remained. It would remain until the rope tightened, or perhaps even after. He turned from the sea. The land waited. The machinery of justice required fuel. Dawn bled into the water. Grey light seeped across the Mersey estuary, turning the black chop into a sheet of hammered lead that stretched towards the shore. Thornton stood at the rail, the wood cold and wet under his palms, watching the shoreline emerge from the mist like a bruise healing slowly. The smell hit him first. Salt vanished, replaced by the thick, cloying odor of wet mud, coal dust, and the sour tang of river refuse that marked the approach to Liverpool. It was the scent of land, but not the clean earth of the country. This was industry breathing. The engine note changed. A deep shudder ran through the deck plates, vibrating up through the soles of his boots as the paddles slowed their churn. The constant rhythm that had held them for the crossing fractured, leaving a gap where the noise should be. Thornton gripped the rail tighter. His stomach lurched, not from the motion now, but from the cessation of it. The body accustoms itself to the fall. The stop is the violence. Slowing, sir. Higgs appeared at his elbow, a dark shape against the brightening sky. The constable's coat was stiff with dried salt, cracking when he moved. Captain says we'll be alongside in 20 minutes. Tugboats are coming out. Thornton nodded. He did not trust his voice. The horizon tilted, then steadied. A trick of the eyes, the inner ear still arguing with the solid ground beneath him. He rubbed his thumb against his index finger, the skin rough, seeking the friction of reality. The warrant in his pocket felt heavy, a lump of lead weighing down the wool. Is he secure? Thornton asked. His voice sounded thin, stripped of the authority he usually carried in the yard. Double-locked, 2 men at the door. Higgs shifted his weight, looking out at the approaching wharves. Cranes stood like skeletal birds along the quay, motionless in the early light. He hasn't made a sound since you left the hold. Silence is a tool. Thornton turned from the rail. The deck seemed to rise to meet him, then drop away. He stumbled, catching himself on a ventilator cowling. The metal was icy. He knows the crowd waits. He is saving his breath for the performance. Performance. Justice requires an audience. Thornton pushed away from the cowl. He walked towards the companionway, his steps deliberate, forcing his legs to accept the stability of the ship. It was harder than climbing. The stillness felt false. Prepare the transfer party, keep the prisoner covered. I want no faces seen until we are in the carriage. The press, sir. Especially them. Thornton paused at the hatch. The darkness below yawned, smelling of bilge and unwashed men. They will print what they wish regardless. Let us give them nothing to sketch but the back of a coat. Higgs nodded, touching the brim of his hat. I'll gather the men. Thornton descended. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against his lungs. The cold taste returned, coating his tongue with the flavor of burnt oil and stale smoke. He reached the hold landing. The guards stood rigid by the cell door, rifles grounded, bayonets fixed. The steel gleamed dull in the lantern light. Inside, Matilda Quarter sat on the crate exactly as before. His hands rested on his knees, palms open. The gold chain lay coiled on the wood beside him, bright as a fresh wound. You hear the change, Thornton said. He did not enter the cell. The bars were cold iron, separating the law from the breach. The engine stops, we arrive. Matilda Quarter looked up. His face was pale, the shadows under his eyes deep bruises, but his posture remained unnervingly upright. England, he said. The word was soft, lacking triumph. You have brought me home to die. I have brought you to answer. Thornton corrected the distinction automatically. Protocol was a shield. The court will decide the manner. The court is the machine. Matilda Quarter leaned forward. The chain shifted, links clicking against each other. You said so yourself, on the deck, in the rain. Thornton stiffened. The memory of his words on the rail surfaced, unwanted. I doubt the machine. He had spoken to the storm, not the prisoner. Yet the words had traveled through the bulkheads, through the wood and iron, finding the one man who needed to hear them. I spoke of the law, Thornton said, not the vessel. They are the same. Matilda Quarter tapped the chain. Both pull men along tracks they did not lay, both crush what stands in the way. He smiled again, that tight, dry expression. You feel it, Inspector, the shake in the floor, the noise in the head. You think it is the sea. It is the weight of what you carry. Thornton said nothing. He watched the prisoner's hands. They were steady, no tremor. A man awaiting the drop should shake. This man vibrated with a different frequency, tuned to a key Thornton could not hear. He turned away. The guards watched him, waiting for an order, a sign of command. He gave them none. He climbed the stairs. The deck air was sharper now, biting at his exposed skin. The ship drifted towards the quay, the gap closing foot by foot. Ropes flew from the wharf, arcing through the grey morning to land on the deck with heavy thuds. Sailors scrambled, hauling the lines taut, the hemp groaning under the strain. The impact jarred the hull, a final, solid thud that resonated in Thornton's chest. They were docked. Higgs waited by the gangway, flanked by 4 constables in uniform. Their helmets gleamed, fresh polish catching the light. Behind them, on the quay, a crowd had already gathered. Men in caps, women with shawls pulled tight, children lifting onto shoulders to see the spectacle. They were silent for now, watching the ship, waiting for the prisoner to emerge. But the anticipation hung in the air, thick as the fog. Thornton joined Higgs. He adjusted his cuffs, pulling the wool down over his wrists. The fabric was damp. Ready. Ready, sir. Higgs checked his watch. A silver onion heavy in the palm. 6 o'clock. The train leaves at 8. We have time. Time is not ours. Thornton looked at the crowd, faces blurred together, a single organism waiting to be fed. Bring him up. Higgs signaled the guards below. Thornton turned his back on the gangway. He looked out at the city. Warehouses rose in tiers, brick upon brick, windows dark and shuttered. Smoke drifted from 1,000 chimneys, low and heavy, trapping the smell of the river. It was a city of iron and steam, built on the same principles as the ship beneath them. Movement, power, inevitability. Footsteps sounded on the planks behind him. Heavy, shackled, the rhythm was slow, deliberate. Matilda Quarter appeared between the guards, a black coat draped over his shoulders to hide the irons. His head was bowed, hat pulled low. The gold chain was tucked inside the coat, hidden from view, but Thornton knew it was there. burning against the skin. The crowd on the quay stirred. A murmur rippled through them, starting at the front and rolling back like wind through grass. Thornton stepped forward, placing himself between the prisoner and the rail. He raised a hand, not to wave, to halt. "Keep them back," Thornton said. His voice carried over the water, flat and hard. "Clear the gangway." Higgs shouted to the dockside constables. They pushed against the press, truncheons raised. The crowd resisted, surging forward, boots scraping on the stone. A shout went up, not cheers, a demand. "Is he there? Show us the murderer." Thornton ignored them. He focused on the prisoner. Matilda, a quarter-lola, had stopped. He lifted his head. The hat brim shadowed his eyes, but the mouth was visible. It moved. "They want to see," Matilda, a quarter-lola, whispered. Only Thornton could hear. "They need to know the beast is caged." "They need to know the law holds," Thornton replied. He gestured to the gangway. "Walk." Matilda, a quarter-lola, took the first step. The wood creaked. The crowd roared. It was a physical sound, hitting Thornton in the chest, louder than the ship's engine, louder than the storm. He followed the prisoner down. The planks flexed under their weight. The shore rose to meet them. The machinery of justice engaged its gears. The smell hit him first. A thick, wet wool scent mixed with the sour tang of stale beer and the sharp, chemical bite of fresh ink that had not yet dried on the blotter. It was the odor of a room where men sat too long without opening a window, where breath recycled until it became part of the furniture, soaking into the plaster and the floorboards. Thornton stood by the door, his back pressed against the cold wood, watching the three magistrates arrange themselves around the table like vultures settling on a carcass that had not yet stopped twitching. They moved with a bureaucratic slowness that grated against the frantic hammering in his own chest, a rhythm he could not quiet no matter how many times he rubbed his thumb against his index finger, seeking the ghost texture of the hat band or the chain. "Place the items before him," Magistrate Vaughan said. His voice was dry, devoid of curiosity, the tone of a man reading a grocery list rather than cataloguing the remnants of a life taken on a moving train. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained cuffs and eyes that refused to meet anyone's gaze, reached into the leather satchel at his feet. He pulled out the hat first. It looked smaller now, crushed and misshapen, the band torn where the police had searched for marks of ownership. He set it on the table with a soft thud. Next came the chain, the gold links dull under the gaslight, coiled like a sleeping snake beside the felt. Finally, the shirt fragment. It was a rag, really, blackened by soot and stiff with dried blood, recovered from the ashes in Mrs. Guppy's scullery before she could feed the whole of it to the fire. Matilda, a quarter-lola, sat opposite them, his hands clasped on the table, the iron shackles gleaming dark against his pale skin. He did not look at the objects. He looked at the wall behind Vaughan, his expression blank, a mask of polite disinterest that seemed almost insulting given the gravity of the pile of evidence growing before him. "Do you recognize these articles, France Matilda, a quarter-lola?" Vaughan asked. He leaned forward, the candlelight catching the grease on his nose. "The hat found in your possession, the chain sold to Mr. Death, the shirt burned in White-Capelle." Matilda, a quarter-lola, blinked. "Once, slowly. I have seen hats before," he said. His English was precise, clipped, each word measured out as if he were paying for them by the syllable. "I have seen chains. Many men wear chains. It is a fashion." "And the shirt," the second magistrate, a man with a beard that seemed to swallow his chin, tapped a quill against the paper. "The one with the blood, the one your landlady tried to destroy." "I wear many shirts." Matilda, a quarter-lola, shrugged, the movement restricted by the heavy coat he still wore despite the heat of the room. "Blood is common in White-Capelle. You know this, gentlemen. A man cuts his hand shaving, he bleeds on his linen. It is not a crime to have a stain." Thornton felt the urge to step forward, to slam his fist on the table and demand the truth, but he held himself still. Protocol. The rulebook burned in his mind, a litany of procedures that demanded patience, that demanded the prisoner hang himself with his own lies before the rope was placed around his neck. He rubbed his thumb again, the skin rough against the callus, grounding himself in the physical sensation while his mind raced through the timeline, the connections, the irrefutable logic that M.A. tilde a quarter Lila was trying to dismantle with vague platitudes. "Bring in Mr. Death," Vaughan ordered. The door opened, and the jeweler shuffled in, a small, nervous man who clutched his hat to his chest as if it were a holy relic. He smelled of metal polish and fear. He did not look at M.A. tilde a quarter Lila. He looked at the chain on the table, his eyes widening slightly before he forced them back to a neutral stare. "Mr. Death," Vaughan said, "look at the chain on the table. Have you seen it before?" "Yes, sir," Death whispered. His voice cracked on the second word. "I have seen it." "Describe the transaction." It was last Tuesday," Death said, his words tumbling out faster now, eager to be done with the telling. "The prisoner came to my shop in Cheapside. He wished to sell a gold chain. I asked the origin. He said it was a gift from a friend. I offered 8 shillings. He took 7. Death finally lifted his gaze, looking directly at M.A. tilde a quarter Lola for the first time. "I remember the link, the third from the clasp. It was bent just so." He mimed the angle with his thumb and forefinger, a tiny, precise gesture. "I straightened it myself before I put it in the till. I remember because I thought it odd. A new chain, bent already." The room went quiet. The only sound was the scratch of the clerk's quill, racing across the paper, capturing every syllable, every hesitation, turning speech into permanent record. Thornton watched M.A. tilde a quarter Lila. The mask slipped, just for a second. The corners of his mouth tightened, a microscopic twitch that betrayed the calm facade, and his eyes flicked down to the chain, to the bent link that now lay coiled like an accusation on the dark wood. "That is a lie," M.A. tilde a quarter Lila said. His voice was lower now, lacking the earlier polish. "He lies. Many chains are bent. It proves nothing." "It proves you were in Cheapside," Vaughan said softly. "It proves you sold the victim's property less than 24 hours after the murder. It proves you knew the value of what you had taken." He leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach. "And it proves, France M.A. tilde a quarter Lila, that you are not the innocent traveler you claim to be, but a thief and a murderer who thought he could outrun the reach of the law by crossing the ocean." M.A. tilde a quarter Lila opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the hat, the chain, the shirt. The physical weight of them seemed to press down on the table, bowing the wood, crushing the air out of the room. He looked at Thornton then, really looked at him, and for the first time Thornton saw the fear. It was not a dramatic terror, no wide eyes or trembling limbs, but a deep, hollow recognition in the prisoner's gaze, the look of a man who realizes the tracks he is on do not lead to freedom, but to a single, inevitable endpoint. "I want to speak," M.A. tilde a quarter Lila said. The words came out in a rush, as if he feared being interrupted before he could change the course of the river. "I wish to make a statement." Vaughan nodded to the clerk. "Right." M.A. tilde a quarter Lila took a breath. It shuddered in his chest, a ragged intake that sounded like a bellows struggling for air. "I did not mean to kill him," he said. The confession hung in the smoky air, stark and ugly, stripping the room of its procedural pretense. "It was a robbery, only a robbery," he fought. "He grabbed my arm, the carriage lurched, we fell." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the table until the knuckles turned white. "When he stopped moving, I took the things. I did not mean for him to die." The quill scratched on, scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was deafening, louder than the confession itself, louder than the blood pounding in Thornton's ears. It was the sound of the machine grinding forward, consuming the human element, reducing a life and a death to ink on paper, to statistics for the morning broadsheets. Thornton felt a sudden, overwhelming nausea, a wave of dizziness that forced him to grip the doorframe to stay upright. He wanted to leave. He wanted to walk out into the cool air of the yard and never come back, but his feet were rooted to the spot, bound by the same invisible tracks that held M.A. tilde a quarter Lila. "Sign it," Vaughan said, pushing the paper across the table. M.A. tilde a quarter Lila reached for the pen. His hand shook now, the tremor visible, the steady frequency broken. He signed his name, the letters jagged and hurried, a poor imitation of the confident script he had used on the passenger manifest. Thornton stepped forward to take the document. As his fingers brushed the paper, he felt the dampness of the ink, fresh and wet, staining his own skin. He looked down at his hand, at the black smear spreading on his thumb, and realized with a jolt of horror that his own signature was next. He took the pen, The weight of it was familiar, yet alien. He bent over the table, the smell of the room filling his lungs, choking him. He began to write, but his hand betrayed him. The careful copperplate he prided himself on dissolved into a jagged scrawl, the letters spiking and falling like the profile of a ruined city. The ink blotched, spreading into the fibers of the paper, a dark, ugly stain that mirrored the blood on the shirt fragment. He tried to stop, to steady his grip, but the tremor in his hand only grew worse, a vibration that traveled up his arm and settled in his chest, sinking with the phantom rattle of train wheels on iron tracks. "Inspector," Vaughan prompted. His voice was impatient now, the boredom replaced by a desire to conclude the business. Thornton forced the pen down. He finished the name, the final letter a desperate hook that tore slightly into the paper. He straightened up, breathing hard, the air wheezing in his throat. He pushed the paper away, unable to look at it, unable to look at Matilda, a quarter-luller, who sat slumped in his chair, the confession complete, the process finished. "The date is set," Vaughan said, gathering his papers, the rustle of them sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Monday, the 14th of November, Newgate." He looked at Thornton, his expression unreadable. "You will be required to attend, Inspector. As the primary investigator, it is customary." Thornton nodded. He could not speak. The word customary echoed in his head, hollow and meaningless. He thought of the drop, the mechanical precision of the gallows, the way the body would jerk, the same sudden lurch that had killed his brother, the same violent stop that had ended Briggs' life. He was bound to it now, not just by duty, but by the signature on the page, the ink stain on his thumb, the terrible, grinding momentum of the justice he had helped to set in motion. "Monday," Thornton whispered. The word tasted of ash. "Indeed," Vaughan said, standing up and adjusting his robes. "Let us hope the weather holds." They filed out, the magistrates, the clerk, the jeweler, leaving Thornton alone in the room with Matilda, a quarter-luller, and the smell of stale beer and wet wool. The prisoner did not look up. He stared at his hands, at the shackles, at the space where the chain had lain. Thornton turned to the door, his hand on the latch, and felt the wood vibrate beneath his palm, a faint, rhythmic thrumming that he knew was not the ship nor the wind, but the city itself, waiting for the final act to begin. The jeweler stepped from the shadow of the doorframe, a small man in a black coat that smelled of camphor and polished brass. He carried a leather case, worn at the corners, which he set upon the table with a thud that echoed in the stagnant air. Matilda, a quarter-luller, did not look at him. The prisoner's gaze remained fixed on the hat, the chain, the shirt fragment, as if staring hard enough might dissolve them into dust, erase the physical proof of his hunger and his haste. Thornton stood by the wall, hands clasped behind his back to hide the tremor in his fingers, watching the color drain from the German's face. It was not a sudden pallor, but a slow seep, like ink spreading through wet blotting paper, draining the vitality from the cheeks until the skin took on the grayish cast of the London fog outside. "Identify the item," Vaughan said. His voice was flat, devoid of curiosity, merely a functionary oiling the wheels of the machine. The jeweler opened the case. Inside lay a velvet cushion, stained with the oil of 1,000 thumbprints. He did not touch the chain on the table. Instead, he produced a ledger from his coat pocket, thick with pages, the spine cracked from use. He opened it to a specific date, running a gnarled finger down the column of entries until he stopped. The silence in the room tightened, pulling at the seams of Thornton's waistcoat, pressing against his ribs until breathing became a conscious effort. He could smell the coal smoke trapped in the wool of his own coat, acrid and persistent, mingling with the sour scent of Matilda, a quarter-luller's unwashed body. "September 7th, the jeweler said. He did not look up from the book. "A gentleman's Albert chain, gold, 15 pennyweights." He tapped the page. "Sold to a Mr. Matthews. Address provided was Lemon Street, Whitecapel." Matthews, the name hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Thornton felt a spike of irritation at the clerk's earlier obstruction, the way the railway manifest had been withheld, yet here was the truth, bound in leather and ink, undeniable. Matilda, a quarter-luller, flinched. It was a small movement, a twitch of the shoulder, but Thornton saw it, the involuntary recoil of a man struck by a blow he had not seen coming. The prisoner's eyes darted to the chain on the table, then back to the ledger, then to the jeweler's face, searching for a lie, a mistake, a way out. There was none. The book was open. The ink was dry. "Did you sell this chain?" Vaughan asked, gesturing to the evidence. "I did," the jeweler said. He finally looked up, his gaze meeting Matilda a quarter lilas. "And I remember the man who bought it, distinctive coat, grey broadcloth, patch on the left elbow." He paused, letting the detail land. He haggled over the price, 2 shillings. Matilda a quarter lila's breath hitched, a ragged intake that sounded like a bellows struggling for air. He looked down at his own hands, shackled now, resting on the table where the chain lay. The iron of the cuffs gleamed in the gaslight, cold and unyielding, mirroring the gold links that bound him to this room, to this moment, to the dead man in the grave. Thornton felt the nausea rise again, a tide of bile in his throat, but he swallowed it down, forcing himself to remain still, to be the witness this procedure required. He thought of his brother, of the inquest that had ruled the death and accident, no ledger, no jeweler, no name to hold accountable for the sudden lurch of the wheels. Here there was a name. Here there was a price. "It was not theft," Matilda a quarter lila said. The words were quiet, barely audible over the scratch of the clerk's quill. "He owed me." "Who owed you?" Vaughan pressed. He leaned forward, the wood of the chair creaking under his weight. "The deceased, Thomas Briggs." Matilda a quarter lila shook his head. A slow, heavy movement. "No, not him. I did not know him." He looked at Thornton, then really looked at him, and for the first time Thornton saw the fear. It was not a dramatic terror, no wide eyes or trembling limbs, but a deep, hollow recognition in the prisoner's gaze, the look of a man who realizes the tracks he is on do not lead to freedom, but to a single, inevitable endpoint. "I needed the money for the passage to America." "The carriage lurched," Thornton said. He did not mean to speak, but the words escaped him, driven by the need to hear the mechanics of it, to understand the violence of the transition from life to death. "You said it was a robbery, only a robbery." Matilda a quarter lila nodded. He touched the chain with one shackled finger, the metal clicking against the iron. "He fought. He grabbed my arm. The carriage lurched. We fell." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the table until the knuckles turned white. "When he stopped moving, I took the things. I did not mean for him to die." The confession hung in the smoky air, stark and ugly, stripping the room of its procedural pretense. It was not a roar of guilt, but a whisper of exhaustion, the admission of a man who had run out of track. Thornton felt a sudden, overwhelming heaviness in his limbs, as if the gravity in the room had increased, pinning him to the floorboards. He wanted to leave. He wanted to walk out into the cool air of the yard and never come back, but his feet were rooted to the spot, bound by the same invisible tracks that held Matilda a quarter lila. The jeweler closed his ledger with a snap that sounded like a pistol shot in the silence. He packed the book away, avoiding the prisoner's eyes, eager to be done with the transaction, to return to the safety of his shop, where gold was measured in weight and not in blood. "Right," Vaughan said to the clerk. The quill scratched on, scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was deafening, louder than the confession itself, louder than the blood pounding in Thornton's ears. It was the sound of the machine grinding forward, consuming the human element, reducing a life and a death to ink on paper, to statistics for the morning broadsheets. Thornton rubbed the palm of his hand against the rough fabric of his trousers, seeking friction, seeking ground. The smell of the room was cloying now, a mix of stale beer, wet wool, and the coppery tang of fear that seemed to emanate from the prisoner's skin. He watched Matilda a quarter lila's shoulders slump, the defiance evaporating like steam from a kettle, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a man who knew the journey was over. "I want to speak," Matilda a quarter lila said. The words came out in a rush, as if he feared being interrupted before he could change the course of the river. "I wish to make a statement." Vaughan nodded to the clerk. "Right." Thornton stepped away from the wall. The movement felt stiff, mechanical, as if his joints had rusted in the damp air. He moved to the table, placing himself between the prisoner and the door, a barrier of blue cloth and authority. He looked at the hat, the chain, the shirt. The physical weight of them seemed to press down on the table, bowing the wood, crushing the air out of the room. He looked at Matilda a quarter lila, waiting for the rest of it, the details that would fill the columns of the Times, the specifics that would satisfy the hunger of the public for blood. But Matilda a quarter lila said nothing more. He simply stared at his hands, at the shackles, at the space where the chain had lain. The quill scratched on, filling the silence, filling the page, filling the gap between the man and the drop that waited for him at Newgate. "Sign it," Vaughan said, pushing the paper across the table. Matilda a quarter lulla reached for the pen. His hand shook now, the tremor visible, the steady frequency broken. He signed his name, the letters jagged and hurried, a poor imitation of the confident script he had used on the passenger manifest. Thornton stepped forward to take the document. As his fingers brushed the paper, he felt the dampness of the ink, fresh and wet, staining his own skin. He looked down at his hand, at the black smear spreading on his thumb, and realized with a jolt of horror that his own signature was next. The ink felt cold, like blood that had cooled on the platform at Hackney, like the rain that washed the gutters clean while the city slept. He took the pen. The weight of it was familiar, yet alien. He bent over the table, the smell of the room filling his lungs, choking him. He began to write, but his hand betrayed him. The careful copperplate he prided himself on dissolved into a jagged scrawl, the letters spiking and falling like the profile of a ruined city. "Inspector," Vaughan prompted. His voice was impatient now, the boredom replaced by a desire to conclude the business. Thornton forced the pen down. He finished the name, the final letter a desperate hook that tore slightly into the paper. He straightened up, breathing hard, the air wheezing in his throat. He pushed the paper away, unable to look at it, unable to look at Matilda a quarter lulla, who sat slumped in his chair, the confession complete, the process finished. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in, the gaslight flickering as if the supply were failing. He needed air. He needed the open sky, the smell of the river, anything but this stagnant box of confessions and ink. "The date is set," Vaughan said, gathering his papers, the rustle of them sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Monday, the 14th of November, Newgate." He looked at Thornton, his expression unreadable. "You will be required to attend, Inspector, as the primary investigator. It is customary." Thornton nodded. He could not speak. The word customary echoed in his head, hollow and meaningless. He thought of the drop, the mechanical precision of the gallows, the way the body would jerk, the same sudden lurch that had killed his brother, the same violent stop that had ended Briggs' life. He was bound to it now, not just by duty, but by the signature on the page, the ink stain on his thumb, the terrible, grinding momentum of the justice he had helped to set in motion. "Monday," Thornton whispered. The word tasted of ash. "Indeed," Vaughan said, standing up and adjusting his robes. "Let us hope the weather holds." They filed out, the magistrates, the clerk, the jeweler, leaving Thornton alone in the room with Matilda a quarter lulla and the smell of stale beer and wet wool. The prisoner did not look up. He stared at his hands, at the shacklessy, or at the space where the chain had lain. Thornton turned to the door, his hand on the latch, and felt the wood vibrate beneath his palm, a faint, rhythmic thrumming that he knew was not the ship, nor the wind, but the city itself, waiting for the final act to begin. The latch clicked, a sound small enough to be swallowed by the damp wool of Vaughan's robe as the magistrate departed, yet it severed the room from the corridor outside with finality. Thornton stood alone with the prisoner and the accumulating weight of the paper on the table. The air in the cell did not move. It hung heavy, saturated with the sour reek of Mullah's unwashed skin, a smell that clung to the back of the throat like grease from a poorly trimmed wick. Mullah remained seated, his head bowed low enough that the light from the single gas yet could not find his eyes, illuminating only the sweat-dampened hair at his nape and the rough weave of his prison shirt. The shackles on his wrists had ceased their rattling, leaving a silence that pressed against the eardrums, dense and suffocating. Thornton looked down at his own hand. The black smear of ink on his thumb had begun to dry, cracking into a fine, dark dust that settled into the whorls of his finger marks, a permanent mark of the transaction just completed. He rubbed the spot with his forefinger, a futile attempt to erase the stain, but the pigment only spread, staining the nail bed a murky gray. "You will hang," Thornton said. The words emerged flat, stripped of any triumph or malice, merely stating the next entry in the ledger. Matilda a circumflex, a quarter lulla did not flinch. He lifted his head slowly, the movement stiff, as if his neck muscles had seized during the long hours of denial. His face was pale, the complexion of a man who has spent too long underground, yet his eyes held a strange, dry clarity. "I know," Matilda a circumflex, a quarter lulla replied. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the German cadence that had once made him sound foreign and suspicious, now reduced to a simple, broken English that anyone might speak. It is the law. The law requires a witness from the investigation, Thornton said, turning away from the table because he could no longer bear to look at the ink on his skin or the defeat in the prisoner's posture. He walked to the small, high window, the glass thick and distorted, offering a view of nothing but a patch of grey sky and the brickwork of the adjacent building. I am required to attend the drop. A noise came from the chair, a sharp intake of breath that might have been a laugh or a sob, truncated before it could fully form. You wish to see the end of it, Inspector, to ensure the machine works as designed. Thornton gripped the iron bar of the window frame. The metal was cold, leaching the warmth from his palm, a sharp contrast to the feverish heat rising in his chest. He thought of the gallows at Newgate, the calculated geometry of the trapdoor, the precise length of rope needed to break a neck without severing the head. It was mechanics, pure, unfeeling mechanics, identical in principle to the coupling rods of a locomotive, the tension of a bridge cable. The same engineering that had thrown Briggs from the carriage would now drop a circumflex a quarter lila into the pit. Progress, measured in feet per second squared. I wish to see justice done, Thornton said, though the phrase tasted hollow, a recitation of duty rather than a conviction of the soul. Justice, a circumflex a quarter lila repeated, the word rolling around his mouth as if testing its texture. Is it justice when the chain is found in a pawnshop and the hat in a gutter, or is it just that the story must have an ending? He shifted in the chair, the wood creaking under his weight. You have your ending, Inspector. The public will sleep soundly knowing the monster is caught. The trains will run full again. Thornton turned back to the room. The gaslight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the hat and the shirt fragment on the table seem to twitch, alive with a residual malice. The trains run regardless of who hangs, a circumflex a quarter lila. That is the nature of the line. It does not care for our morality. Then why are you shaking? Thornton froze. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, a fine, rapid vibration that traveled up his forearms, settling in the shoulders. He clasped them together tightly, forcing the bones to lock, trying to suppress the physical betrayal. It was the same tremor that had seized him 3 years ago when the coroner read the verdict on his brother's death, the same involuntary reaction to the sudden, violent halt of a life. The room felt smaller, the walls leaning in, the air growing thin and difficult to draw into his lungs. He needed to leave. The proximity to the prisoner, the smell of the confession, the impending date of the executioner, it was all converging into a single point of pressure behind his eyes. I am not shaking, Thornton lied, his voice tight. I am cold. A circumflex a quarter lila smiled, a brief, humorless curving of the lips that did not reach his eyes. It is August, Inspector. The heat is oppressive outside these walls. You are not cold. He leaned forward, the chains tightening with a metallic clink. You are afraid that when the drop falls, you will see your brother's face in mine. Thornton slammed his hand onto the table. The impact sent a jolt through the wood, causing the inkwell to jump and spill a single drop of black fluid onto the deposition paper, blooming outward like a fresh wound. Enough. The word cracked through the room, sharp and authoritative, silencing the prisoner instantly. A circumflex a quarter lila leaned back, the smile vanishing, replaced by a mask of weary resignation. He looked at the spilled ink, then up at Thornton, his expression unreadable. The silence returned, heavier than before, filled only by the distant, muffled roar of London traffic, the rumble of carts and omnibuses that vibrated through the foundation of the prison, a constant reminder of the world continuing its indifferent march forward. Thornton stared at the blotch of ink, watching it soak into the fiber of the paper, obscuring the final lines of the confession. It was a flaw in the record, an imperfection in the perfect procedural narrative he had constructed. He should have called for a clerk to rewrite it. He should have demanded a fresh sheet, but he lacked the energy, the effort required to summon help, to explain the mistake, to wait for the new document felt insurmountable. Clean it, a circumflex, a quarter lila said softly, nodding at the spill. Thornton ignored him. He reached for his hat, pulling it down low over his eyes to shield them from the glare of the gaslight and the scrutiny of the prisoner. He moved towards the door, his steps measured and deliberate, refusing to let the tremor in his legs betray him further. His hand found the latch, the iron cool and solid under his palm. He paused, his back to the room, unable to turn and face the man he had hunted, the man whose death he had now signed into existence. "Monday," Thornton said, the word dropping into the silence like a stone into a well. "Do not make me wait." "I shall be ready," a circumflex a quarter Lola answered. "The schedule is sacred, is it not?" Thornton pulled the door open. The noise from the corridor rushed in, a cacophony of shouting warders and slamming gates, shattering the claustrophobic quiet of the cell. He stepped out into the flow of the prison, leaving the door ajar behind him, letting the sliver of light from the corridor cut across the floor where a circumflex a quarter Lola sat in the gathering gloom. He did not look back. He walked briskly down the stone flagstones, the sound of his boots echoing in the narrow passage, matching the rhythm of the heartbeat thundering in his ears. He had to get out. He had to find the river, the open sky, anything that was not enclosed by brick and bound by the date on the calendar. The ink on his thumb felt heavy, a lead weight dragging his hand down, reminding him that the hunt was over, but the execution remained, a final, mechanical inevitability that he could not escape. The fog did not roll in. It sat, a wet wool blanket draped over the yard, smelling of damp straw and the sour breath of 10,000 waiting men. Thornton stood against the cold stone of Newgate, the masonry leaching the warmth from his spine, while the crowd beyond the railing surged like a single heaving organism. They wanted blood. Not justice, not closure, but the wet snap of the rope and the dangling weight of a man who had killed for a watch and a hat. A woman near the front screamed, a high, thin sound that cut through the low murmur, then was swallowed instantly by the press of bodies. Thornton rubbed his thumb against his index finger, the skin rough and dry, seeking the phantom texture of the gold chain he had recovered weeks ago. It was gone now, returned to the bereaved family, yet the ghost of its links remained etched into the ridges of his finger marks. "Move back," a warder shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "Keep the line, damn you." The barrier groaned, wood strained against the shove of shoulders, boots scuffing the cobblestones, creating a friction that sparked no light but generated a heat Thornton could feel from 10 paces away. He adjusted his collar, the starched linen chafing against his throat, a futile defense against the choking density of the air. Coal smoke hung low, trapped beneath the cloud ceiling, mixing with the exhalations of the mob to create a soup that coated the tongue with grit. He tasted it, copper and ash, the flavor of the city's industry and its hunger. 8 o'clock approached. The clock tower above the debtor's door ticked, a mechanical heartbeat louder than the crowd, counting down the seconds until the state took its due. Thornton watched the scaffold platform, empty save for the trapdoors and the beam overhead. No drama waited there. No last speeches would be delivered, no grand gestures made. William Calcraft would perform his duty with the efficiency of a railway clerk stamping a ticket, a transaction of flesh for law. The thought made Thornton's stomach turn, a slow, rolling nausea that had nothing to do with the fog. He remembered the drop in the carriage, the sudden lurch that had ended Thomas Briggs, and now this drop, engineered to end France a quarter Lila, 2 mechanics, 1 purpose. "Inspector." The voice came from his left, low and hesitant. A young constable, face pale beneath his helmet, gripping his truncheon so tightly his knuckles had turned the color of old bone. "Sir, the governor asks if you are ready to witness." Thornton looked at the boy, seeing the tremor in his hands, the wide, unblinking stare fixed on the scaffold. He wanted to tell the lad to look away, to find a patch of sky and count the clouds until it was over, but the words stuck in his throat. Protocol demanded presence. The record required eyes. "I am here," Thornton said, his voice gravelly stripped of emotion. "That is enough." The constable nodded, though he did not move, remaining anchored to Thornton's side as if the inspector were a lightning rod against the chaos. The crowd roared again, a wave of sound that physically pushed against them, forcing Thornton to brace his feet. They knew the time. They felt it in their bones, a collective anticipation that vibrated through the pavement and up into the soles of his boots. A man near the railings laughed, a sharp, barking sound that held no humor, only a desperate need for the spectacle to begin. Then the side door opened. Matilda a quarter Lilla emerged, flanked by two chaplains and the executioner. He walked with a stiff, deliberate gait, his hands pinioned, his head bowed slightly under the weight of the white cap that obscured his features. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Thornton. He moved towards the center of the platform as if walking to a train carriage he had paid to enter, a passenger resigned to the destination. Calcraft guided him to the spot, his movements practiced, devoid of malice or mercy. The trapdoors stood ready, dark rectangles in the wooden floor. Thornton stopped breathing. He held the air in his lungs, his chest tight, waiting for the mechanism to engage. The crowd hushed, the silence falling not like a curtain but like a heavy weight, pressing down on the yard until the only sound was the scuff of Matilda a quarter Lilla's boots on the plank. Calcraft stepped away. The lever was pulled. The thud was not loud. It was a dull, final impact, the sound of a heavy sack of grain hitting the floor of a warehouse or a carriage door slamming shut in a tunnel. The body dropped. The rope snapped taut with a violent jerk that visible even from the ground, a sudden cessation of motion that left the air ringing. Matilda a quarter Lilla danced for a moment, a grotesque puppet on a single string, his legs kicking out in a reflex that belonged to a living man before settling into stillness. It was done. The crowd erupted, a roar of satisfaction that washed over the walls, but Thornton heard none of it. He stared at the swinging form, the grey coat hanging straight, the boots motionless. There was no triumph in his chest, no relief that the hunt had ended, only a profound, hollow exhaustion, as if the energy required to sustain the chase had been siphoned from his marrow, leaving him brittle and empty. He thought of his brother, of the twisted metal and the silence of the grave, and realized that this changed nothing. The railway would run tomorrow. Men would board carriages, trust in the iron tracks, and die just as easily, just as anonymously. Justice was a procedure, a box to be ticked, not a cure for the world's violence. Cut him down, the governor's voice drifted from the shadows, mundane and bureaucratic. Calcraft moved to the body, beginning the grim work of release. Thornton turned away. He could not watch the final indignity, the reduction of a man to a corpse to be carted away in a van. He walked towards the archway, pushing past the constable who still stood frozen, his eyes wide with a horror he would carry for decades. "Sir," the boy called out, his voice trembling, "where are you going?" "Home," Thornton said, not slowing his pace. "The work is finished." He stepped out of the prison gates and into the street, where the fog had thinned slightly, revealing the grey smear of dawn breaking over the rooftops. A hansom cab waited nearby, the driver asleep on the box, reins loose in his lap. Thornton ignored it. He began to walk, his boots clicking on the wet stones, the rhythm steady and unyielding. In the distance, beyond the sprawl of chimneys and spires, a train whistle blew, a long, mournful note that pierced the morning air. It was the North London line, starting its day, indifferent to the death that had just occurred within the stone walls behind him. The sound did not make him flinch. It did not send a chill through his blood or bring back the memory of the crash. It was just noise, a signal that the world continued, that engines fired and wheels turned, carrying passengers towards their fates with blind, mechanical certainty. Thornton pulled his coat tighter around himself, the fabric damp with mist, and kept walking. He would go to the station. He would board a train. He would sit by the window and watch the city blur past, accepting that some tracks never lead back to safety and that the only peace to be found was in the rhythm of the ride itself. The whistle blew again, closer this time, and he did not look up, letting the sound wash over him, a lullaby for a city that had learned to sleep with one eye open. The governor's order hung in the damp air, a mundane instruction that shattered the sacred horror of the moment into mere administrative procedure. "Cut him down." Calcraft moved with the efficiency of a man winding a clock, his hands busy with the knots while the crowd's roar swelled again, a beast fed and now baying for the next spectacle. Thornton turned his back on the scaffold before the knife could touch the rope. He could not bear to witness the final undignified collapse, the way a human being becomes nothing more than ballast to be loaded into a van. The reduction felt obscene, a violation worse than the murder itself, stripping Franz Matilda a quarter Lila of the last shred of agency he had possessed even in death. "So," the constable's voice cracked, thin and reedy against the stone archway. The boy stood frozen, his truncheon hanging loose at his side, eyes wide and fixed on the swaying grey coat, as if expecting the dead man to rise and offer an apology. "Where are you going?" Thornton did not break his stride. His boots struck the wet flagstones with a sharp, rhythmic click that drowned out the distant murmur of the prison guards. "Home," he said, the word dropping flat between them. "The work is finished." He pushed through the archway, the rough stone brushing against his shoulder, a tactile reminder of the solid, unyielding world outside the theater of justice. The fog had thinned to a grey smear, clinging to the rooftops like stale smoke from 1,000 extinguished grates, revealing the jagged silhouette of Newgate against a sky that promised no warmth. A hansom cab waited near the curb, the horse stamping impatiently, steam rising from its nostrils in white puffs that vanished into the gloom. The driver slept on the box, his chin tucked to his chest, reins slack in gloved hands, oblivious to the history that had just been written behind the wall. Thornton walked past it. He needed the motion. The stillness of the scaffold had seeped into his bones, a cold rigidity that only the rhythm of walking could loosen. His coat felt heavy, the wool saturated with the mist, dragging at his shoulders as if weighted with lead shot. Each step was a deliberate act of will, a rejection of the urge to run, to flee the scent of hemp and fresh-turned earth that seemed to cling to his clothes. Somewhere beyond the sprawl of chimneys and the dense cluster of spires, a sound pierced the morning. A train whistle. Long, mournful, unmistakable. It was the North London line, waking from its brief nocturnal slumber to begin the day's relentless circuit. The note hung in the air, vibrating through the damp atmosphere, a sonic thread connecting the prison yard to the distant tracks at Hackney. It did not sound like a warning. It did not carry the shriek of a beast in pain. It was simply a signal, an announcement of departure that cared nothing for the blood spilled within the stone walls of Newgate. Thornton paused. For 3 years, that sound had been a trigger, a jagged hook that dragged him back to the twisted metal and the silence of his brother's grave. It had sent a jolt of panic through his chest, a visceral fear of the sudden lurch, the mechanical indifference that could crush a life without malice. He waited for the tremor now, for the familiar tightening of his throat, the shallow breathing that made him feel as though he were drowning on dry land. Nothing came. The whistle blew again, closer this time, the pitch rising as the engine gathered speed. The sound washed over him, neutral and impersonal like the rain or the wind. It was just noise, a fact of the city. The world continued, engines fired, wheels turned, and passengers boarded carriages with the same blind trust they had held yesterday, before the drop, before the rope, before the confession. He pulled his coat tighter, the damp fabric chilling his skin, and resumed walking. The pavement stretched ahead, a ribbon of grey stone leading towards the station. He would board a train today. He would sit by the window, his hands folded in his lap, and watch the city blur past in a smear of brick and soot. There was no victory in this, no restoration of the innocent past where carriages were safe and strangers were neighbours. That time was dead, buried with Thomas Briggs, and now with France Matilda a quarter Lila. Some tracks never led back to safety. The realization settled in his chest, not as a wound, but as a heavy, accepted truth. The railway was a beast that fed on speed and anonymity, birthed a new kind of death that no amount of police work could fully inoculate against. Justice was not a cure. It was a procedure, a box ticked, a body cut down and carted away. The only peace available was in the rhythm of the ride itself, the steady clatter of wheels on iron that marked the passage of time regardless of who lived or died. Thornton reached the corner where the street dipped towards King's Cross. The whistle sounded once more, a final declaration of presence that echoed off the warehouse walls. He did not look up. He did not flinch. He let the sound fill the space around him, a lullaby for a city that had learned to sleep with one eye open, and stepped onto the path that would take him to the platform. The gates of the station loomed ahead, dark iron bars against the grey dawn, waiting to swallow him whole. The iron gates groaned on their hinges as he pushed them open, the sound scraping against the morning quiet like a knife on a whetstone. Inside, the station breathed. Great clouds of white steam curled around the roof trusses, obscuring the glass panels above until the sky was nothing more than a diffused grey luminance overhead. Porters in red jackets hurried past with barrows of leather trunks, their boots slapping the wet pavement, shouting destinations that meant nothing to him. Liverpool, York, Manchester, places where men lived and died without the weight of a rope around their neck. Thornton approached the ticket window. The glass was smeared with grime, separating him from the clerk inside who sat hunched over a ledger, pen scratching rhythmically against the paper. "Return." The clerk did not look up. His voice was flat, bored, accustomed to the transaction of lives, moving from one point to another without question. "Single." Thornton placed a shilling on the ledge. The coin clicked against the wood, a small, sharp sound that seemed to hang in the air between them. "Wherever the next train goes." The clerk paused. His pen hovered over the page, ink pooling at the nib before he dipped it back into the well. He looked at Thornton then, really looked, his eyes tracing the grey pallor of the inspector's face, the damp stain on the shoulder of his coat, the exhaustion that hung off him like a second uniform. "Camden," the clerk said. He slid a small cardboard ticket through the slot. It landed face down. "Platform 4, mind the gap." Thornton took the ticket. The edge was stiff, cutting slightly into his thumb. He turned away from the window and walked towards the platform, the card feeling heavy in his pocket, an anchor dragging against his hip. The train waited there, a black beast chained to the rails, steam venting from its cylinders in rhythmic hisses that matched the beating of his own heart. Slow, steady, unafraid. He climbed the steps into the first-class carriage. The interior smelled of stale tobacco, gas oil, and the lingering scent of wet wool from previous passengers. Velvet seats lined the walls, worn smooth at the edges where thousands of hands had gripped them for balance. He chose the corner facing the engine, sitting down heavily as the upholstery sighed beneath his weight. The wood paneling was cold against his back. Outside, a porter waved a green flag. The whistle blew, sharp and imperative. The carriage lurched. Thornton's hands gripped the seat edges, knuckles whitening. The old fear sparked, a reflexive tightening in the gut, the memory of twisted metal and the silence of a grave. He waited for the panic to rise, for the throat to close, for the need to flee this metal coffin before it gathered speed. It did not come. The wheels began to turn, clattering over the points with a rhythmic clack-hiss that vibrated through the soles of his boots. The station slid away, the iron pillars marching past the window like a regiment of soldiers standing guard over the dead. Smoke billowed from the engine, darkening the glass, turning the world outside into a shifting tableau of shadow and light. He leaned forward, wiping a circle on the pane with his sleeve. The grime smeared, leaving a clear patch through which he could see the city unfolding. Brick houses huddled together, their chimneys pouring black smoke into the low sky. Women in shawls hurried along the canal towpaths, heads down against the wind. Children played in the gutters, unmindful of the train thundering past, unmindful of the man who had hung an hour before. Life continued. It did not pause for justice. It did not halt for the dead. Thornton settled back into the seat. The motion of the train was soothing now, a rocking cradle that lulled the mind into a state of suspension. He thought of Matilda a quarter Lila, swinging in the cold air of the prison yard, the body still warm perhaps, still twitching with the residual electricity of nerve endings firing into the void. He thought of Briggs, thrown from a similar carriage, falling onto the ballast with a crunch of bone that no one heard until it was too late. 2 men, 1 rope, 1 train. The landscape opened up as they left the dense cluster of the city behind. Fields of brown earth stretched out to the horizon, scarred by the cuts of new railways and the scars of old industry. A cow stood in a ditch, staring blankly at the passing carriages, chewing cud with a slow, circular motion of its jaw. It did not flee. It did not know the difference between peace and progress. Thornton reached into his pocket and pulled out his notebook. The leather cover was worn, the pages filled with his jagged scrawl, the ink blotting where his hand had shaken during the chase. He opened it to a fresh page. The paper was white, stark against the dim light of the carriage. He dipped his pen into the inkwell at his side, the nib scratching as he wrote the date. 14 November, 1864. He paused, the pen hovered over the paper. There was nothing more to write. The case was closed. The evidence was locked away. The prisoner was dead. The report would be typed, filed, and forgotten within the year, buried beneath stacks of newer crimes, newer horrors born of the same iron tracks that carried him home. He closed the book. The sound of the cover snapping shut echoed in the small compartment. Outside, the train began to slow. The whistle sounded again, a lower note this time, signaling the approach of the station. The brakes engaged with a scream of metal on metal, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness beneath the carriage. Thornton stood up as the wheels ground to a halt, his body swaying slightly with the deceleration. He felt steady, grounded. He stepped onto the platform. The air here was colder, biting at his exposed skin, carrying the scent of cold dust and wet earth. Porters were already moving towards the luggage van, shouting to one another as they unloaded trunks. A woman waited by the gate, holding a bouquet of wilting flowers, her eyes scanning the faces of the disembarking passengers. She was not looking for him. No one was. Thornton buttoned his coat against the wind. He touched the ticket in his pocket, the cardboard soft now from the warmth of his hand. He would walk home from here. The distance was manageable. The air would do him good, clear the smoke from his lungs, wash away the scent of the prison yard that still clung to his hair. He turned away from the station, merging into the flow of people leaving the platform. A man bumped into him, muttering an apology without stopping, rushing to catch a cab. Thornton stepped aside, letting the crowd flow around him like water around a stone. He did not hurry. There was no need. The chase was over. The tracks ended here. Above the rooftops, the sky was clearing. A patch of pale blue appeared through the breaking clouds, fragile and distant. He looked up at it, feeling the cool air fill his chest, deep and steady. The city roared around him, a cacophony of wheels and voices and steam, but beneath it all he heard the silence, the quiet space between the notes, the piece of a job finished, however grim the cost. He walked into the street, the cobblestones slick under his boots, and did not look back at the train. The Carriage of Silent Iron is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Sird Hans Lofredith Arswidus Mr. T. Briggs, Banker Gan Frans Muller Idrael, I Gifs Edinadiad Ardidid Lun, Taqued 14, 1864, Internet Archive. Sird Hans Lofredith Arswidus Mr. T. Briggs, Y Banker, Gan Frans Muller, Idrael, I Gifs Edinadiad Ardidid Lun, Taqued 14, 1864, Internet Archive. Frans Muller. Regulation of Railways Act, 1868. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.